Oh, look at all these fine people. Andrew and Javier and Philip and Michelle. How are y'all doing? Y'all doing all right? Hi,
Doing
Andrew.
good.
You doing all right?
Hey,
Hey, Philip. How you doing?
yeah.
You doing all right? Thank you for checking out that Cadell video. I appreciate it.
Oh my God. I mean, any chance to see you two go at it for 4 hours? Sign me up. But also the last net, I haven't finished that. Javier, I was talking to Javier off over Instagram, and he was like, "You gotta watch the last net. It was really, really good." I'm like 2 hours into that, and yeah, it is really, really good. I'm also reading Levinas right now,
Ah,
so I just thought a lot of what we were talking about, which you kept pointing to, is just like when he's talking about totality, uh, when he's talking about transcendence. To me, this is all part of the circling, the orbiting
yep,
here,
yep.
and maintaining an orbit instead of, I want to say, like grabbing hold, like breaking the fourth wall, boxing. Like I think like in storytelling, when a character breaks the fourth wall, like I was actually studying Ferris Bueller's Day Off 2 days ago with Alex for the short, because I think lack actually appears most in film in the fourth, when the character breaks the fourth wall, because they have really set the parameters. They have made objects of their world so much so, and they're so fixed that they they're able to break the fourth wall and talk about everything from like the narrator perspective. And in that sense, they're lacking so much in terms of like an unfolding. So like in my mind, Ferris Bueller, it was in the beginning, he was breaking the fourth wall because he wanted all the attention around himself. And then by the end of the story, like post credits, I don't know if you remember, but there's a post credit where it's like he's breaking the fourth wall again, and he's like in the bathroom, and he's like, "What are you guys still doing here? Get out of here, scram!" And like the whole point to me, I don't know if they did this intentionally, was just that basically he doesn't want the attention anymore. He became aware of his ironic situation insofar as he was gaining attention at the price of having good relationships. And he, by the end, didn't want the attention anymore in order to have and maintain the good relationships. And that to me is what Ferris Bueller is really about. Um, and it just made me think about a lot of the lack situation, in that when you notice what you're lacking, there's something very positive about it. And then that's when you see that positive aspect in the lack, you're able to, and the story kind of begins, and you're able to have a sense of the next lack that you're going to be entering into. And not saying it's just like a fix, oh, you're in this lack, it's just whatever you're currently focused on, what you're fixed on in terms of lack. That's just what I mean. So I don't know. That's just something that I've been thinking about in like lately, about when we are talking about lack, like when we're talking about a shadow, we're almost talking like we're breaking the fourth wall. We're talking like we're in this meta position, and because we're talking like that, there's a certain lacking of accepting that we're in this fourth wall position, and therefore we can't let necessarily the story unfold. Now, what that means in terms of like a conversation, I've been thinking about actually for the past 2 weeks, and it was like basically a way to get there is like, okay, in what we're doing with the net, what is the story here? Who's the main character? Is it you, Daniel? Is it Philip, or is it Michelle? Like who, like, or like in this like online community like philosophy portal, which I need to sign up. It's like I'm so delayed in doing that. Honestly, I really need to do that. But like who's the main character? Is it the collective entity as the main character? And in that sense, like I just want to try to make what we do into a living story, into what is the aim here in terms of a story, not necessarily like a goal that we personally have, but like what is, if we were to make a story up with what we're doing here, what would be that story? Who would be the main character? In that sense, we would kind of break out of being in that fourth wall position. I don't know, just fun thought experiment, I suppose. But I'll pass it off to whoever.
The main character, I think, would be this emerging subjectivity.
Yep,
We're
yep, yep.
seeking this type of jouissance. Maybe it will be a fourth wall breaking explanation that can address the situation that we're in, which you called Holy Saturday. I thought very, very insightfully. I thought that was really nice, and I think that's what will emerge out of that. I think is a new type of enjoyment, which is a clearing of sorts where the story will unfold. And the idea, I think that one of the wrenches you throw in it that I think is real nice, Daniel, is you talk about Osho and how it can't just be a question of look at all of us, finding the unity consciousness. Not that there's anything wrong with realizing that type of spiritual awareness, but it may not be enough. And indeed, anything we can think of may not be enough. So that's kind of a fun situation to be in, where there has been a precedent when we gather as a species that the older people would be able to say, hey, I know what's coming around the corner, and I can tell you guys how you have to organize yourself to prepare, and you have to become more mature, and here are the steps of how you can become more mature. And right now I think we're just getting a lot of fluff from the older generations, because there is an inability for them to really say, we don't know where to go, because we don't actually know what kind of a problem we're in, because it's so, like, the second you think you have it pinned down, it takes on 50 different permutations, like super fast, which Land puts his finger on. He puts his finger on that exactly, and it's just like, we're probably not going to catch up. But then there's other people that are like, no, the the vague commitment would be to love over desire. And then someone goes, well, what form does that take? And it's like, it's going to be different for each person.
No, it's a brilliant comment, Philip. Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir. I'll pass it on to Javier Rivera. Well, this brings it. First off, I love this idea that that lack is the fourth wall, breaking the fourth wall in a sense when you consider lack. I think that's very interesting. And then what's funny is, it's very difficult to have a story that breaks the fourth wall and then returns to the story. Because usually when you break the fourth wall, that kind of kills it, right? And it's almost like the danger, because Mr. Jockin and I were talking on the danger of lack, and yet it seems to be also tied to this new subjectivity beauty. Lack breaks the fourth wall, and it's almost like we're at a historic moment where I think the main character is this emergent subjectivity. Now that's a loaded phrase. The childhood is talked about in the book on this Holy Saturday. And I'll also note quickly, following a book like Generations, which I do like, although I don't like the fourth turning kind of summary book. This is the age of where the older generation is kind of decadent, and they're like, you're fine, just do what we did, and it doesn't work, which is precisely why new spiritual awakening is possible in the next generation out of the nihilism, because the younger generation is forced to look for things that in decadence they would never look for. Because why? Things are working, right? And so you actually can get kind of, the way they talk about it is the Great Awakening, these spiritual revivals, which are characterized by a new form of subjectivity. And actually, ironically, it is, or paradoxically, more precisely, it is precisely when the older generation doesn't know when you should do, and all hope is lost, that a new quality of hope comes forth. Therefore, the Holy Saturday thing. And I'm glad you like that, Philip. Thank you for pointing that out. What's interesting now is it's precisely seemingly increasingly with the absolute choice, as Jock and I were talking about at the end, which is the need to recover something like lack, the spreading of the conditions of the absolute choice, that lack is not nothing versus lack is nothing. Ergo, it has, if it is not nothing, it has the possibility of having a drive function, like Javier was saying, because, because I think lack is in this sense tied to drive, because when I don't have a turkey sandwich, and I don't want a turkey sandwich, it's nothing to me. But when I want a turkey sandwich and I don't have one, it's lacking. So there's automatically a certain orientation to lack that is not there with nothing. But I think that also speaks to the danger that Mr. Jockin is pointing out, because when I don't have a turkey sandwich and I really want it, it's lacking, I might become pathological to get it. Or I might become crazy to get it, or who knows what I do to get it, right? But maybe that lack could actually teach me to be, oh, I don't know, patient or control my hunger. Maybe a good could come out of that. It depends on my choice of response to that lack, of which then, even if I make the choice that lack is not nothing, there are still risks in that. Versus even if I say lack is nothing, right? But we're reaching this kind of saturation point, it almost seems, to use the Alex Ebert language, where we have to make the absolute choice that lack is not nothing. But that means we have to break the fourth wall, like Luber is saying, right? Well, the moment you break the fourth wall, it's real hard to get back to the story. And yet breaking the fourth wall for the human being seems to be necessary for the theme. But this is the risk. Like, this is why there's this real challenge of how to go about that. I'll stop there and pass it on. But the argument I would then say is a lot of the story for me then is tied to I do strongly believe this has ramifications for economics, politics, sociology, communities, relationships, and all of these things unfolding in all of those different areas. Because, so for example, if let's take Mr. Barnes and Raymond's work of the rat utopia. Capitalism leads to a rat utopia, right? Where, you know, all the mice are eating themselves, John Cahoon, we're screwed, right? The utopia experiment. It would seem that only lack could deal with that problem, because it create drive even if you are in prosperity, right? Like, you could create demand, not just stimulate demand. So if there's something about capitalism where the very because here's my key point. The rat utopia experiment, and I think Samuel, Mr. Barnes, and Raymond were great on this, that is going to be the AI world. If AI doesn't kill us, AI will easily be the rat utopia world. And in that situation, it would seem as if in order to have, you know, all the mice not just killing themselves, and that being the forcing function out back into stimulation, it would seem you would need a new source of drive or activity, if you will. And that seems to be tied with lack. But the moment you break the fourth wall, you're at risk of going crazy and ruining the story, right? Because everything is chaos, right? So there's real risk here. And yet this seems, as Mr. Jockin has pointed out, and I really enjoyed that exchange. So thank you for staying late, Mr. Jockin. That was a treat. Thank you all over the last few weeks for staying for the entire day. You guys are great. But I think the stakes are very real. And I think the story, I guess I would ask you as a story writer, when it comes to you, Mr. Lou, but not that you have to talk about this, it seems as if a story can't begin, though, until you get clarity on the stakes, right? Like the stakes, because theme and command emerge. Like, what you see is an emergence of a clarity of the stakes, and ergo subjectivities in people that are aware of those stakes and thus can be driven by it. And then, you know, the story unfolds from there. But let me pass it to Javier and then Mr. Luber. Javier Rivera, it is good to see you today, sir.
Yeah, good to see you guys. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, I think the breaking the fourth wall, this risk, I think it's something that Jockin and I would call, like, basically virtual knowledge, right? This is the trap that could unfold here. Geez. So one thing is that I noticed, you know, kind of just reading Aristotle again with Jockin, is this idea that, well, one, if lack is a kind of cause, you could say right now it's only taken as a sort of linear cause. It only got one effect, okay? And Jockin, you can elaborate on this. You know, Aristotle's idea of the rational formula is not that there is just one effect. There's choices that you can choose from this effect or from this cause. So I think that's the problem right now, is that lack only has one direction, or you could say it only has one direction in the sense that it's to close it, right? And I'm trying to point out the irony here in terms of, isn't it ironic that lack as a cause, as a kind of drive, is the very thing that is also attempting to close itself, right? And this is where the virtual knowledge comes in, because virtual knowledge would see that lack isn't a necessity. Lack is a something provisional. It can be closed. Of course, there's several ways that we can understand lack, or like the way Aristotle understands privation. You know, one is this idea of incompleteness. But I think the danger with incompleteness, as we can see, is that well, that also leads into optimization. So how do we think about, instead of always in completion, why don't we think about there's a sort of constancy of insufficiency, or something that Jockin and I were talking about, like it's a sort of like entropy is always going on with lack. Lack has a sort of analogous relationship with entropy, which is why we always have to keep maintaining repetition, habits, everything. But then virtual knowledge comes in and it gets even more messy. So I guess you could say, my question for this framing actually is, when we have this sort of virtual knowledge within, you could say, the context of the surprise, and like generally I would think that the surprise is what something should jar me out of myself. It should be something that breaks me into the fourth wall. And yet there is that temptation that we just take that knowledge and we go back in, but in the worst way possible. I guess you could say, like, this would be the example of, like, you're surprised that the bridge collapsed. Then you realize that, you know, that you just didn't have enough support. You lack support on one side. So now you're like, okay, cool. Like, we just patched that up, and every other bridge, we just think that we just need to cover over the lack, right? Make sure that there's nothing that's lacking. See, that's the danger right there, is that even though the surprise would jar you, it'd be like, oh yeah, we're lacking. We didn't realize that there was lack. We just thought it was gone. Everything was good. So yeah, I mean, I'll leave it there as just kind of thoughts, but yeah.
Excellent, and I'll pass to Mr. Luber. Well, on Gödel, I think that is very good. You know, I think what's very important for me, a way I always take the incompleteness, is Gödel makes it quite clear that you have to choose between the coherence of a system or its correspondence, and you can't have both. So you can't, if you have a system of mathematics that is entirely coherent, you can never establish axioms. And if you establish axioms, you have to sacrifice the coherence. So the incompleteness is always a lacking from one of those positions. Furthermore, in Gödel, you could have, there's a way in which you say, well, that would mean a theory, and Graham Dempsey was pointing this out, and he's correct. For Gödel, the incompleteness would not mean that a theory of everything, quote unquote, is impossible. It would mean that any theory of everything would have to include incompleteness. It would have to entail a point of which it is not complete. So it would always be a theory of everything that's open, an open theory of everything. Well, that's weird, because if it's open, that means it's not of everything, right? So you have this contradictory character to it. Oh, wait, what if it just means that the fourth dimension of lack has to be included? Because there's a way on what we're describing that lack has a kind of fourth dimensionality. This is a metaphor. Don't take that too seriously. That in all, like, three-dimensional space, you would never see that fourth dimension, but it's there, almost like the Flatlanders, right? And then this is kind of the issue. It's almost like, so you were talking about this irony, because, you know, with Luber, and we would, like, a story begins when a protagonist realizes an ironic situation. And it's almost like what has happened is, for most of human history, we've been engaged in the irony of, say, saying, oh, lack is nothing, so don't worry about it. And that's been precisely what's made it not go away and made it worse and worse. Oh, I'm going to fulfill lack. You know, I'm going to get, and then it will go away. So you're in an irony. And what's increasingly happening because of the Calzer, quote unquote, from the book of AI, or just the city, we're going, wait a minute. What if lack is not nothing? And then you realize the irony of all of human history, and the very effort to escape lack is precisely why you don't, and actually makes it a nothing. The thing that you did to make lack nothing in your life by calling it nothing, ironically, is what makes it, like, painful. Where actually you say, no, lack is not nothing. I need to learn the art of it. Now you're moving out of the irony, and you've met the command, the theme of, you must choose that lack is not nothing. Well, now the stories begin. So the question is, what is the story that begins now? And I think these conversations like the net are the clarity of the irony so that the story can begin. I'm not sure if the net is the story, but as we know in the book, like, conversations like this, the ironic situation, once it realizes the theme, then the ironic situation retrospectively becomes part of the story, as if it was always part of the story. But you have to have that click, to have that retrospective causality that makes the ironic situation, that if it never glimpsed the theme, would have only ever been an ironic situation. But now it's as if it was always already going to be part of the story. And the story does seem to be tied to this absolute choice on if lack is nothing or if lack is not nothing. which is critical. And then the character, and then the question, then I'll give it to you, Mr. Luber. Then for me, and I like what you were saying on virtual now, I'll give it to Luber, Jockin, and then Philip. To me, what would be the nature of the story that follows? I think it has a lot to do with forgiveness, and the problem of forgiveness and the difficulty of forgiveness, which is tied to the possibility of freedom with others. And can we live to forgive? Can we learn to forgive? The story of learning to forgive with people that we don't understand. I think there's something about this is some sort of story about forgiveness, because forgiveness, and Michelle and I were talking about it. We had a talk with Nina Power. Forgiveness is a really big deal. And I'm not sure if we've really actually learned how to forgive. And forgiveness seems to be tied to the necessary meta layer that humans could relate to one another outside of systems without tribalizing. So if we don't know what forgiveness is or learn the story of forgiveness, it seems very difficult for us not to fall into self-effacement. Now, that has to be expanded on. I said a lot right there, but let me give it to Mr. Luber, Mr. Jockin, and Philip Shinn. Mr. Luber.
Okay, yeah, a lot of, per usual, good things said. I'm trying to get my thoughts in a row. So, first, I want to, I guess, what Phil was saying, like the pinning down. To me, if we ever get to a point where we have things pinned down, then we're just in a situation where we broke the fourth wall again. Like, we're not actually where we broke the fourth wall, the story unfolds like in a non-fourth wall breaking way. We're just, the story is unfolding, so to speak, in a Ferris Bueller fourth wall. To me, that's why just the notion of like pinning down, I like Kant in the sense that he's trying to find posits. To me, theme is like the ultimate posit in a certain respect. So in that sense, like a stake, a lot of writers, I think of stakes in terms of like having a fixed position. So there's a certain lack of dynamicness to the stakes in a lot of stories, in my opinion. And when you actually encounter stakes, you're actually encountering a posit that you actually posited yourself. It actually caused you to like implicitly make a posit, and that's why you are relating to it, because you kind of want to see how the question takes form, takes shape. Where I think the aspect of like surprise, it's the aspect of surprise only exists when you see stakes as a posit, not as a fixed position. Otherwise, you're not actually surprised, and you kind of guess what can happen. So, to me, this lacking, this just not having a fixed position, to me is just like double downing infinitude. You're recognizing that it's finite. You're recognizing that it's finite, so therefore optimization isn't actually optimizing in the finite sense. To me, if you're optimizing in the finite sense, and I think, I forget where you said this, Daniel, but you touched on this point where it's just like optimization could kind of be, I don't know what the word that you said, but to me, the word that's coming to mind is like a formation, taking form, the form is rising up to actuality. And in that sense, that's what's being optimized. And it's not like optimization, how we see it today, is just like out of touch with finitude. And that's why, like with a lot of TV shows, the endings suck just because they're not taking finitude seriously when they're telling the story, and they're kind of like pushing it back, pushing it away. And I think that's very like symbolic to like how a lot of people think in terms of life, where it's just like, we'll get to the death, we'll get to the mortal aspect of it all just later, not now. I'm only 28. That'll be when I'm like 80 or something. Like I'll think about that then. I'll act in accordance to my mortality more so then. Like, my brother's just graduating college. It was just like, yeah, I'll stop partying like when I grow up, kind of way. And I'm like, well, you're already there in a way. So it's just like a choice. It's either now or later. And you just don't want to like face that choice in a certain respect. Not saying that my brother is like that, but I think a lot of college kids, at least when I went to college, was definitely like that. So I think how do you pin down something without pinning it down? How do you have stakes without them being just a fixed stake? To me, it's where poetry and storytelling really come into play, where you're saying something that is the interpretation is fixed, but the understanding is not. The understanding of it is very much in the air, but you can interpret exactly what's happening. And I know that's like a very like very nuanced distinction between interpretation and understanding. But I think if you just focus on there being a very fixed interpretation, it actually gets to the point where the understanding is ambiguous in a good way. Like if something's so clearly interpretable, it's like when you first meet someone and it's like, I am Andrew. And you could just look at me, you could have a conversation with me, but you might not understand me, but you can definitely say, and you can definitely turn to other people and be like, that's Andrew. He's white and 5'8" and has curly hair. Like that's like a fixed position. But how you understand that, I think it changes over time. It's like a constant posit that you have in a certain sense, even if it's not explicit. And then because that's the case, I agree with you where it's like forgiveness is really where, like, when the story unfolds, what is it like unfolding? And in my mind, every story is linked to the logic of forgiveness, because the story, in a sense, splits from itself by questioning its own nature in a certain sense. And then there's so many ways of like having the split kind of the conclusion, aka the coming together would be the conclusion, and it making sense of itself. And in that sense, it's like when you write a story, it's like the same question: do you want to have the relation or not? If you want to have the relation, then what will happen is, if you're actually positing the stakes, is that how the story concludes will reveal itself to you. You don't actually make the choice. Like, I like to think that I actually make no choices when I tell stories, and that I'm just constantly positing ways in which there are stakes. And when I do that, it kind of fits what happens next in the story, kind of just like fits in where it should fit. It's not necessarily I'm like controlling it manually. There's something that's out of my control, but I put myself in a position to realize it by positing. And I think that's like the key with lack. It's like how to look at lack in a non-fixed way. That way, when the next lack in your life reveals itself, you can respond properly to it, because you are just trying to get into a conclusion. It's just making sense of the situation. You're kind of letting it ride, and you're I guess the best way to say it is just like, it feels good when the next lack is realized, because you when you get in a pattern with it, you kind of stakes in a way that you're positing the stakes, and then as time goes on, it kind of like you kind of understand what you're lacking, and then the next lack emerges, and then it's just like the same process over again, and you can become accustomed to that. And I think that is the goal. I think Jockin said in the last video, where it's just like, are we doing this for ourselves, or are we like doing it for other people, like self-help? And to me, the answer is both. If I'm able to get acquainted with the process of lacking, I want to call that, then it makes everyone around me more to get acquainted with the process, like closed off to like how you're positing your stakes. It's like you're letting your friends and loved ones know how you're positing your stakes, and in that sense they're kind of like in the story with you, and in that sense it makes them feel comfortable to posit their stakes and kind of make the understanding of that stake to happen, and then simultaneously the reveal of the next lack will occur. I feel like I said a lot. I'm just trying to get my thoughts in a row here, so forgive me if I'm jumping all over the place, but I'll pass it off.
Not at all. I think you said a lot. Pass it to Jockin, Philip, and Javier. So to me, what you're describing when I think about dancing, like the lack, you get in the habit, you're able to dance with the lack, and the lack makes possible the dancing. Whereas if you're fragile versus anti-fragile, then every lack that comes up, you're not ready for, and you have to get through with basically dumb luck. So a few things very quickly, because I think the question of forgiveness is big, because very often, you have all these spiritual traditions that say love one another. I think we forget how much love and forgiveness were tied together in revenge societies, where basically like love for us means I, will bake you cookies. Back then there's like, you don't take revenge. Like loving the other is really tied to a not taking revenge. And one of the reasons why I think we don't see love, because all the spiritual traditions have something to say, it's something about love. There's something about love is the story at the end of the day, right? Well, then it's something about forgiveness too. Because the spiritual traditions are like, well, it's easy to love people you like. The question is like loving people you don't like and who will unintentionally hurt you and misunderstand one another. Well, then we're talking about something with forgiveness. And forgiveness seems to be the openness to love with the other that allows some sort of emergent property of beauty and dance that otherwise cannot occur. Now, that has to be unpacked. But the other thing I was going to say is to what you were saying about stakes that are moving. And Cheeton, good to see you, sir. I'm obsessed with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of all the historic episodes, I read everything I can about it because I basically think the story of humanity is tied to that kind of thing. Because basically, eventually an episode is going to arise. And here's the problem. We make a huge mistake of teaching history like World War II versus let's go in live and know what it was like to be in the middle of the unfolding of the 13 days. That's the secret. We teach history in a fixed way, so it's irrelevant. Likewise, we teach relationships in a fixed way versus that moment of surprise where you find yourself in a relationship caught up by a logic that feels like it has a life of its own. This is the key. We need to study the major historic episodes on the ground, which could get into art, where a logic seems to live outside the subjects. You don't get that effect when you generally study World War II. Okay, Allies good, Nazis bad. Got it. No. Get in there and feel the logic almost like an anti-theme. I don't know, I'm making up something. Like the command, it's pulling you now. And here's the issue. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, we survived by luck. We're still in the irony. We have not actually learned the subjectivity to be able to go outside of the Cuban Missile Crisis beyond luck. And basically, this is what I think is happening. Right now, you have the emergence of a theme for a new type of subjectivity that would be able to survive a Cuban Missile Crisis via choice, not luck. And basically, my argument is the following, to look really far ahead and belonging again, is that basically another Cuban Missile Crisis is coming. In your individual life, in your relationships, in your communities, in your governments, in your world, it's coming. And if you don't have the subjectivity for that, you'll be stuck in the Kafka little hall. You'll be stuck in the thing pulling you along to something you cannot stop. And next time it may not be so lucky. Next time the story may actually finally end as a tragedy versus a comedia. We're preparing for the moment when rationality has a life of its own. And that requires the work of a different kind of subjectivity that I think lack is critical for developing. Without lack, we cannot develop the subjectivity that could survive the Cuban Missile Crisis other than by luck. And basically, the clock is ticking. But let me pass it to Mr. Jockin, Philip Shinn, and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Jockin.
Way to drop the stakes, Daniel. Damn. By the way, the question of what's the stakes, excuse me, I think it is that. You're going global societal scale. I mean, I would say on the pragmatics of, I think, individual lives. I'm just saying our subjectivities are not equipped to handle the circumstances that we're in. Suicide rates, depression rates, I can go down the list. So obviously, whatever models and structures we have are not working. And thus, this is the project. I'm sorry. This is the project that I think this is what we're trying to address here. Like, why does this matter? And, it's funny because, I mean, Javier's been on a mission the last week. It's been very much a pleasure working with him. His interest in lack from Aristotle. But I want to circle back first with what Luber said. I mean, Luber, I think you're making a great argument. Like, one of the properties of lack is this indefinite excess, right? The idea of polysemy, right? The idea of many meanings. If an object, a text, a person, take your pick, is so clearly, obviously understood in one mode and one way only, that's dead. You got it, you move on. It's literally, as Daniel said, it's studying history where you get Allies good, Nazis bad, and that's the read. No, that's not the read. I mean, that's it's funny, a lot of times arguments, it's interesting, Aristotle associates history with poetry. They're related. I don't think that's an accident. That's not an accident at all. And in fact, I think the best, I see Daniel Daniel's clicking because it's absolutely yes. I just say because my favorite histories are, for example, like Robert Caro's The Power Broker and the Path to Power, historian Lyndon Johnson. I think those are fantastic historical texts in my opinion, but they're absolutely in the structure of poetry. Okay, and the reason why is there's a polysemy of meaning and reading through that text. It's delightful. So I think Luber, I think you're absolutely correct on that point. And by the way, actually, I'm thinking about this. It's interesting about stakes. Like all this exhaustion narratively of multiverses. I just find I find it interesting. We almost make an argument. I felt this way watching multiverse plots and narratives. There's no stakes because you could just keep inventing new things. So as I love really animated on this response about this. So I love Luber. Luber, if you're watching, I'd love to hear you can DM me about these points just privately on this question, or anyone else wants to talk about that. That's interesting. A narrative does not work if we know there's no stakes. There's that way of like a default exit ramp of, we could just ult a new villain, a new reality, a new possibility. We almost need the constriction of a narrative to give the stakes any substance to it. Now, with that said, I stand super hard for the Spider-Verse, basically across the Spider-Verse and into the I love that series. I absolutely love it. I watched the Across the Spider-Verse about 5 times in the theater. I was an evangelist. I literally was grabbing people to come watching it with me. And I don't bring it up because what's interesting is this thing about canon events. Like you have this huge it's the same multiverse story, like all these different Spider-Mans and But what's I find very interesting, what is the common attribute, the common identity of Spider-Man, regardless of all this diversity? I mean, literally, we got like dinosaur Spider-Man, okay? We got like ridiculousness all over the place. It's this thing called canon events. And these canon events are always tragedies. It is always a striking of some massive tragedy. That is the canon event that is inescapable. And the main tension point of the plot is exactly that point. One of the characters wants to avoid the canon event from happening in his reality, but by doing that, he would destroy what it means to be Spider-Man, and it has all these secondary effects because of that. I think the third movie is going to be very interesting about how they navigate that plot, but I find that interesting that almost the identity of Spider-Man, even this multiverse kind of like indefinite excess, just like blowing up, like billions and billions of Spider-Man, it's still this individual. It's this privational tragedy. I'm using privation intentionally. I'm not saying lack, I'm saying privation, because it's basically a stripping away. It's always a stripping away in the story of Spider-Man. Something's lost. Uncle Ben, a spouse, a loved one, right? So I think I'm just pointing out, again, this is more for Luber. If you're watching this recording, Luber, love you. Just love to hear your opinion about that. I find that very interesting from a narrative point of view. I also want to bring out, I was talking to Javier about this, again, like this property of lack has absolutely, we've talked this many times in this group, and I'm very thankful for it. I find it's very thankful, even though there's been some contention, some energy in the group about it, is this idea of time with lack. There's absolutely a core, like, there's a discussion. I mean, sometimes it's drawn as a distinction of loss versus lack, but I find it's basically functionally the same, right? The idea that there is an idea of what was once had is removed, which is traditionally said. That's, I think, the fairest way to say privation is probably that operation. But then there's the not yet. It's not yet. The example from Aristotle is, you would not say a man becoming beautiful is not beautiful. He's becoming beautiful. And that's an example he references of lack from there. So it's a kind of not yet for the subject. So going towards something. But it's not here yet. So again, that's in it. And I know for internally, again, I find very much benefit these discussions, because Javier kind of brought it up. And I think a lot of the discussions in prior weeks have talked about this in the net, is this idea of knowledge, lack in knowledge versus ontological lack. If I had to make a very coarse distinction, you can call it subjective. I'm of the argument knowledge is subjective. Like it's in the subjects. I only say that too because Aristotle has that, because the only thing that can be both present in and instead of a subject is knowledge. I find that a fact, which is I'm very sympathetic why Plato said virtue was knowledge. I see why, because it's basically the only thing that can operate in the set of and present in all combinations, both set of and not set of, set and the four modes that can be represented from categories in Aristotle. It's knowledge. Knowledge exists in all modes of those, so it's a very reasonable argument. But of course, that's the point. Is that that's not the case. Those are accounts. Those are narrative things. Like those are all these. I could see all the argumentation of the subjectivity aspect of lack from that point of view. I think it's very fair. But what basically Javier and me were talking about, I'll just pause it. I don't want to take over time with this. Was the other status, the ontological lack, and we use the bridge collapse as the example of that. But I want to point out something I've been meditating separately. I'd love to hear the group's opinions about it. I find it interesting when we use knowledge, we use reason to measure. When we do acts of measurement, we almost have a natural instinct to want to push it to the limit. Whatever we're measuring, we have a drive to want to push it to the limit. Give it an example is in design history. When typography got much more from a craft skill that was just taught in a very casual way to being applied with geometric measurement of compass and ruler and very particular measurements, very particular unit systems, very particular understanding of the composition of the alloys that make the paper. Once rationalization of a craft process was done, we had this exactly at the same time a drive towards extremes of all these different properties: size, really big, really small, really extremely small sizes, really huge sizes, very fine details of fonts, very extreme decorative natures of fonts. I just found that in other correlations too, in other domains, whenever measurement shows up, there's almost a drive to push it to the limit, to self-destroy whatever that subject is. I also say that because a lot of times related, I know in this group we talk about schizophrenia, or their states of mental instability. They use reason all the time. You ever see those memes of like the diagrams and doing all the crazy shit? It's not that they're not applying methods to what they're doing. It's just not grounded to reality. Like that's what I'm getting at. This is what I'm building my argument to say knowledge is virtual in this way. That's why it's so dangerous. I think Daniel, I'm reading Alone Again Part 2, and I got your video. I'm watching your videos about it. You talk about this unbounded rationality. Autonomous rationality is completely it can destroy itself, and these are just examples of it and just applications of it. So I'd love to hear the group's thought about that, just meditating on that issue. I just say it because it was discussed in the symposium Javier hosted. It came at the very end, that question of measuring lack. What do we do? The best answer we came up with was a slight discussion about symmetry versus asymmetry, which is fascinating because Aristotle does say that like lack astraesis is discussed in one way about inequality, right? These kind of removable, these like privational states of the thing. But that we use that to actually understand the thing. We know a thing is a point because it's indivisible. You know, see what I'm saying? It's like kind of that's why we get this idea of like it's negational because of these ways it's talked about. All right. Last note. By the way, Daniel, again, on the topic of reading Belonging Again Part 2, what was said before by Philip, this idea of the elder, right? And actually them not having any knowledge to give us. Isn't this not very correlated to your Plato cave discussion? Yeah, there it is. I'm a big fan of that. I'm going to bring it in. So # plug, go get Daniel's book and Michelle's book. Fantastic read. I'm enjoying it. I just started reading it. I just find it interesting, the idea, like exactly, like the question, who's the first educator? Especially under states and conditions where the boomers can't teach us shit. Like, which I don't think is nothing new, by the way. I've definitely think the Greeks had this period. There's definitely mentions in the Greeks there where, again, these elders are unequipped to address the challenges of the contemporary time. And the youth have to basically self-invent an entire new subjectivity, account, mode of approach. So I'm just saying, Daniel, go to town, please. Like, please give us a elucidation on this point, because I can see the analogy, a connection immediately on that. One last note. I've been just meditating, Daniel, from the part 1 of Belonging Again, this breaking the fourth wall. I would love your reflection on this, like, operation of the act of suspension of disbelief. Like, it doesn't not apply to this case. Like, it's almost like the whole point is that lack as a surprise, rather it be ontological or it be subjective accounting, either way. Nevertheless, the whole pretense is that it's almost like the Heidegger broken hammer effect, where all of a sudden there's like this shock of your suspension of disbelief was just now blasted. It's a fourth wall break. Now the thing is, most people close the gap immediately, right? They either disengage, or do something to quickly get around it. But nevertheless, that's kind of like when we see there's a glimpse. Sometimes those glimpses are not exactly pleasant ones. They're shall be more like shattered glass effects as opposed to just seeing a beautiful sunset, for example. But I just like to hear meditation and thoughts about this, or anyone else anyway, by the way. All right, that's all I got.
Oh, magnificent. Thank you, Mr. Jockin. Pass it to Philip and Javier. And Mr. Luber, Mr. Jockin was sharing in our hatred of multiverses, so that was really good. And yeah, it destroys the stakes, but the ones where it works, there's a limiting principle where you're sticking to one character. And also, I think it's important that in the Spider-Verse, all the Spider-Men are like notably different. Like they're different characters. So there's a sense of a limiting and singular character, even though there's a multiverse, you don't feel, and you said it critically, there's a tragedy that cannot be escaped no matter what multiverse you go to. That changes everything. Also, but one of the reasons why it's risky is actually because you're conflating the actual potential and the virtual in a way. You're saying that the actual has a virtual character in of itself versus the virtual be the lack of which can only be faced by the subject, right? So this is the funny thing. Whenever you remove the virtual, you threaten the stakes. Because the stakes are found, and I think you put it very well, that there's something about virtue that is the always not yet, that is located in the virtual, that is only possible with knowledge, that then makes possible this kind of fullness of time. You're in 2 times at the same time, and yet not. You're still just located here. And this seems to be then something that you would be required to do in order to escape that Kafka hallway or Nash equilibrium. How would you get out of that unless you could occupy, in a sense, a different location from the Cuban Missile Crisis that's just pulling you along? You would have to be able to think outside of that situation. And again, I think the stakes is that human beings have not figured out how to survive when rationality gets ahead of us other than by luck. That is the critical story. That's everything will ride on this. Few more things. You're exactly right with the elder in the cave. Yes. There's no elders. How do we leave the cave on itself? That's exactly right. Which then forces us to think that problem. Exactly what you were saying on the transit believability that James Wood talks about. This is exactly right, because basically what it requires is, and actually it's tied to the question of sociology, which I'm arguing and just put out a video on that we never did, because we hid the problems of sociology with capital to create new mediation without thinking difference. Because here's the thing, pluralism makes you see the mechanisms of socialization in society. The moment because of difference, and you go, wow, I could be different. Wow, actually there are structures that mediate my relationships without me knowing about it, and then they lose authority. It's like the issue is the following. How do you make a magic trick still magical to people that know the trickery? That seems impossible, but this is our challenge. This is what we have to do, because we know the mechanisms of socialization. We know the mechanisms of givens. We know the mechanisms of the subject, and we know how power works. And we're like, that is oppressive. But then it turns out, as Philip Reeve taught us in the mall, that if all you do is destroy the givens, That doesn't work because we're overwhelmed by existential anxiety. Well, how do you get back to givens? You have to somehow do a magic trick when you know the trickery. It would seem as if lack is the only possibility of this, because lack is something that is always outside your schematization, ergo beauty. This is something that we never know the mechanism of it. Like, even if we know how to, here's the trick. You don't know the internal mechanisms of beauty per se, even if you can learn the conditions of orbiting it. And that's, now we're talking some sort of structure that can bring us back to what we lost in the 19th century, that if we don't get, there are various problems. And the elders can't help us because they didn't have to face that problem, so nobody's going to come. But then what do you have available to you in Plato's cave that would make it possible, the realization of all this? And this is where we talk with Ebert. Lack is there. You can have lack in the cave. Limit can be there. The encountering of these things can be there. And so then, if from lack it is possible to leave the cave, as we were talking last week, from the encounter of limit, then it is theoretically possible to deal with this problem that has been left to us from the 19th century. Now, the mechanisms of doing that would have to be expounded on, but everything you said was very good. The last thing I'll say, but there's more, is the history problem. We absolutely should teach history through biography. Last Lion, the Grant, the Power Broker, the Moses. We did the biography of Moses. Shelby Foote, who did a tremendous trilogy on the Civil War, he was a very interesting, and Second Thoughts we talk about with Hayden White. Shelby Foote once said, inspired by Keats, or a commentator on Keats, he said, "A fact is not a truth until you love it." And he said the only ways we learn history is if we love history, because then we're brought into the story and it changes us. But that means you have to tell facts in the form of story. If facts are not told in the form of story, you will not fall in love and you will not learn it, because it will not be integrated into you. So he basically was enraged. Shelby Foote was fascinating because he's like, all these history departments are destroying us because they are not creating the conditions that people fall in love with this history. Thus it becomes a truth. Thus it becomes part of them. And then it can change their conditionality. I completely agree. And there's something in that has contributed to us not identifying the stakes, because when you really get a book like Countdown to the Armageddon by Kershaw on the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you read books, I love biographies, or like the Keynes, by all of these different things, you see that, oh my gosh, the stakes are these situations when rationality gets ahead of you and it has a life of its own. And that's where what you said about measure, and then I'll give it to Shinn and Javier. This is the secret. Rationality has its own internal drive, per se, to measure everything, and it can eat itself in that. It can develop a life of its own, and that is precisely the problem of consistent systems. And this is what a conspiracy is. A conspiracy is a completely logical system that is entirely coherent and denies its lack of correspondence. So it's incomplete, but it denies its lack of correspondence because it assumes that if it's coherent, it must correspond because it's able to cohere. And here's the funny thing. This is why lack is dangerous. It is able to do that because it is lacking something that would force it to acknowledge that it's denied its correspondence. So the lack of which can allow the possibility of rationality getting a life of its own, because you can deny that rationality won't reach its end. You can deny that it won't actually achieve what it's after, that it will just measure everything into paper clips or whatever. You can deny that because of lack, but the lack is also the thing that makes it possible to leave Plato's cave on your own and deal with the issues that the 19th century has left us with. And that's why identifying the structures of rationality leading to conflicts of mind, Pandora's rationality in the map is indestructible, and the problem of rationality being able to get a life of its own, if you do not know that, then you will never identify that the stakes are figuring out how to make choices beyond the rationality that gets a life of its own. In fact, you'll think the story of humanity is creating a rationality that gets the life of its own. And that will be the tragedy. And that would mean humanity never created a story. It just existed in an ironic situation that didn't even have the dignity of a story. But if, in fact, we could absolutely choose that lack is not nothing, then it could be as if we are always already, just like virtue according to the virtual, just like that, it will be as if we were always already participating in the possibility of the story, of being ready for the situations of which can surprise us, because rationality, when it gets a life of its own, always surprises us. That's history. History is stories of these moments, like the Guns of August on World War I, or reading some of the diplomacy books, these moments when rationality is in a game theory dynamic, it gets ahead of you. And if you're ready for that, because you've emergently conditioned the subject, like we talk about in these conversations on the net, to be able to deal with lack, you have the possibility of getting beyond the rationality that has a life of its own. And if we do not figure to do this, if we do not figure out how to do this, then the story of humanity will be a Kafka story, like a little fable. But let me pass it to Philip, Shinn, and Javier. Philip.
What a clusterfuck. I love it. One of the things with the multiverse is this question of unfalsifiability. And I just want to posit that there are a lot of people right now who see philosophy as doing that. They're like almost on the level of like Aristophanes when he was writing The Clouds. Like, you guys are focusing on questions that are unfalsifiable. Even when we're talking about stuff that's like very in our minds concrete. And this has to do with that magic trick you're talking about with the givens. How can you establish new givens when each time you try, people are saying you're totalitarian, you're power grabbing? Clearly you're saying something I don't understand. How are you going to make that happen? And instead of entertaining it, it's just instantly dismissed. And there are these ideas of like, hey, we're in the best possible system we could ever get. It's gone really, really bad before. Let's just behave and, you know, try to climb to the top as best we can. I think one of the things you were saying with polysemy, Jockin, is how does it relate with monosemy? And there's a lot of that going on. I think some of the things that we're able to do here, Dan, and sometimes you talk about, oh, I think it might be like 80%, forgive me if that number's wrong, of our energy is taken up with economics and sex, like our intimate partner. And so you got an extra 20. Some people watch the football game and stare at the TV. We get on this and do this. The idea there being that we all know we're not solely agents of economic production, but it's sometimes hard to be like, well, what else do I do to kind of have like associations with words that aren't like overdetermined. And then I got to talk about habit versus novelty when it comes to what you were saying about measure, and also what Luber was saying about story. I mean, look, obviously when we're watching like a story on a screen, they've taken a lot of the habit out. It has to be like a lot of novelty, or else like people would probably get a little bored. But it seems to me like real life is mostly habit. There's a lot of repetition that happens daily. And as far as like measuring, I think if we don't establish some kind of self-limit, you fall into an Illich disablement. And I'll use bodybuilding as an example. I know we've talked about this before. Obsessed with dudes' muscles. Maybe we need a lot of muscles to pull the people out of the cave. I don't know. They're like, you can take Trent and you can get uber jacked, and probably inspired by like some images that you've seen of like humans that are just ridiculously large. You could also go through the day in, day out habit. And instead of being like, oh, a movie star put on 40 pounds of muscle in 6 weeks to get ready to play superhero XYZ, you focus on this middle year problem that we've brought up before. That is to say, from the age of 30 to 60, if I put on, a quarter a pound of muscle a year, per year, and you say for 30 years. That, I mean, to me is like, this is a measure that doesn't fall into like an egregious growth or extreme pattern. It's not right now like coming from what Hegel calls Sittlichkeit, like a custom or a more. probably that is more something like, um, I don't know, moving to like having diabetes in your 60s. That seems to be much, much more like in our country what we're going through. And I think here, if we can just keep on coming up with, it feels like we're coming up with different ways of saying something very similar. And it reminds me a little bit of like the question of mind between Aurobindo and Eckhart Tolle, where like Eckhart Tolle will say, you have to go beyond mind in order to enter into presence. And Aurobindo will say there's something like presence, and then there's something like the nature focused part of your mind. And those two are coexistent and they're always running. And what you have to do is open the door to this supermind and exist in that for as long as you can and just observe what the sort of, the habit goes through. And like a lot of what we're dealing with now is Lacan's problem of the 3 generation symbolic ripple. And this is like one of the things I think the older generation actually can do is you can just pay attention to the words that they're repeating and just be like, hey dad, what did your dad tell you is valuable? Because you're probably living out your grandparents' values because your parents probably didn't like have enough time to stop and be like, let me deconstruct all of this. They were probably just like, here are a bunch of things that were unobserved. I got a lot on my plate right now. And so how can we collectively transcend the father? And this is like new demands, new desires. And I think a lot of it has to do with the future of work, where a lot of people are not necessarily like, I don't want to work, but like, I don't want work that's mindless and makes me feel like I am just very, very, worth very little. And then the final thing I'll say is the self-help, moving from like an A is A to an AB self-help, so that we're having an omni consideration for that division, not only of self and other within, but also outside of us, so that lack, virtue, and knowledge can go through a reframing. And like, how might that reframing work its way into economics, into politics, into living with the upcoming technological changes, and so on?
Outstanding. I'll pass it to Javier. I mean, definitely for me, like, what's very interesting is I think story is very related to this because definitely you can use the older generation to collect stories. But here's the key. We're in an age where we need to gather stories by which we then can, like Hegel, look for the emergent pattern by which to operate versus receive directions. Because that's kind of the issue. Like, this is a story gathering age to see what was lacking. This is the key. Like, story can help you see what's lacking, but most of the time we've been taught, no, you learn history to know what to do. No, I need to gather the stories to see what's lacking from it, right? Like, you read the Cuban Missile Crisis, what's the lesson? Hope for luck. I'm not sure about that. But this is why, to me, honestly, when you study these radical historic episodes, it is the revelation of lack. When you look at it generally, without being in the logic of when it gets the game theory, then nah, man, what you need is nukes and sea power and stuff like that. Like, you don't get a lesson of lack because you're too far away. What's very interesting is lack comes out in the particular and the partial object, like Jockin, with the definitive. Go to a particular freaking episode and figure out what you're going to do. Like, right now, it's hard not to see that most of history has been decided by luck. Hitler overslept. Oh, okay. What? It was foggy when Washington was doing what? Like, there's a lot of luck. And I do wonder if now, because the stakes are so high, it's almost like now you have to have the subjectivity that doesn't rely on luck, right? But that is what has been kind of lacking. Now, the problem is you can't systemize this lack thing. So there's something about the development of the subject on this level, right? And so I like what you were saying, because I think a lot about how, in the same way that Hegel turned to history to see kind of the movement of thought, like I think philosophers that don't like, this is what I think Plato is talking with, like poetry and story and literature. Philosophers should be very, very aware of story, of literature, of seeing logic unfolds, because that shows you the limit, dare I say, AB. It shows you, oh, wait, actually, life is such a thing. Because I was going to say to Mr. Luber, like what I find, like when you're writing a story, when you set it up, suddenly an idea comes and you feel the logic of the story getting ahead of you, like, and the characters get a life of their own. Like, and that's actually the same as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The logic gets ahead of you, but a good story writer is then able to add the non-rationality, so the thing that gets ahead of you actually turns into a beautiful commedia versus a tragedy, right? Like a good story writer actually is waiting for the moment where the characters get a life of their own, and rather than force the characters into their idea of the plot, their rationality, the whole way, to say, no, I need to add a shire. I need to add a setting. I need to add these non-rational things to allow this to keep going, to develop. Because actually, ironically, you say, no, we have. Let me put it this way. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, you go, no, we need rational to stop this. No, the irony is that keeps it going. Actually, to stop it, you say, no, let's actually talk more. Because here's the thing. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, basically the back channels between Kennedy and Khrushchev, I was speaking to Ebert about this, had a big deal. Well, rationally, you would never talk with Khrushchev. That's going to escalate, and they're the enemy, and it's going to make things worse, and then we're going to lose. No, that was actually what stopped. The thing that you thought would cause the problem is actually what led to humanity, empathy, seeing the person of the other person, which was a non-rational factor that allowed the process to escape the Nash equilibria. And the story writer learns this. They learn, okay, I had a rational structure of what was good to do for the story or not. I'm going to let that go now. I couldn't have gotten to this point where I let it be in the Thomas Wynne sense, this place where I let it go if I didn't have the structure, but this is where I need to let it go. And maybe up ahead, I bring back rationality because structure will be needed, but that ability to feel like, no, I got to bring in the non-rationality, I got to bring in the lack, I got to bring in the B. That is, when you look back at history, is precisely what makes all the difference. It makes the difference is knowing when to bring in. And yet, ironically, often you feel like if you do that thing that will stop the situation, that's precisely what will make the situation worse. And that's why courage is tied to it. That's why facing your limitation of knowing what's best is tied to it, and et cetera, so forth. But let me pass it to Javier Rivera, Chetan, and then Mr. Jockin. Javier Rivera.
Geez. Okay, so let's address the elder question. Jockin never got me back on my Meno thing, but maybe you can address it now. Yeah, so in Plato's Meno, I actually really like this idea of right opinion, mainly because now it would seem so contradictory for that to even be possible. And here's my reframing of Plato's right opinion, actually, to include lack in a more sufficient way, even though I think Plato actually includes right opinion with having lack. So the idea would be understanding that not only does the elders lack, but that, the students lack, or the generation after the elders lack. But you could say that the lack of the position of lack would actually be that the elders might have a right opinion. The question is understanding that even the elder himself lacks in the midst of you accepting such knowledge. And Plato talks about this, like right opinion, you want to, it's not as secure, it's very fleeting. So I really like this, because then that means that even the right opinion must by itself lack. So instead of this dialogue, that I hear between cultures about, we should just listen to the elders because they knew a lot of things that we didn't know. But then there's the other side. It's like, well, we shouldn't listen to them because they don't really understand the context of our situation. Yes, that's I would say both sides are correct in some sense. But then there is this total dismissal or, throwing the baby with the bathwater kind of thing. So I think actually, I won't even say it's a middle position, but a position of lack would be right opinion. And then how would we navigate right opinion? What would that look like? I actually think that would be sort of the pragmatic case of this. What would right opinion look like? Then the other thing that I've been wanting to talk about is this idea. I mean, I think Luber had it right? Like the lack must always be lacking. This is precisely why we cannot pin it down. But it seems like if we talk about this story a bit more, Daniel, and you've been talking about this a lot, is that the absence itself was necessary for us to understand lack in the first place. So that means absence is itself a part of the story. The question is, not only how do we deal with lack, but how do we deal with absence? Because absence itself is a part of the story. And so here's the thing that I see is that when we talk about virtual knowledge, the danger with virtual knowledge is that virtual knowledge doesn't see that itself lacks. But once there's ontological lack overlaid with virtual knowledge, it sort of absences itself, meaning that the models correspond to reality, reality corresponds to the model. It's very nice and neat. And so the absence, two lacks make it go absent, I would say. But this is what's interesting about having a kind of entropy behind a kind of absence. The entropy behind the absence is that the lack will reveal that there is a double absence, right? The surprise, the so on. So I really like this idea that somehow absence is necessary in order for us to actually not pin down lack, I would say. The question is, how necessary? Is there a correct approach to this? Should there be one? Or should we be, in some sense, take a more Hegelian move where we say that the virtuality of knowledge is always lacking? So meaning that even if there appears to be things that go absent, that things are not lacking for us, we can kind of do this double move where we understand that there is. And the question might be, where is it? And that might give us some sense of direction. You could say now we're orbiting around the lack versus letting the lack orbit us. So yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it there because I said a lot.
No, it's lovely. I mean, definitely. So for me, like I always take the Hegel, and then I'll give it to Cheetah and Thomas Jockin, the Hegelian move, where you say there was a time where lack had to be nothing to us historically because we were not ready to think of lack as a present absence, even if there were thinkers like Aristotle that presented it, because there had to be the movement, the saturation, to use Mr. Ebert's language, where that, even when you say lack is not nothing, now it's meaningful to you. So let's put it this way. Before the saturation point, you could say all you want, lack is not nothing, but it doesn't have the same before you get to say a meta crisis or the meaning crisis or this point where it's very clear that the subject needs to be structured alternative. Right. So like Hegel will be like, oh, you start with being, you have that for a few thousand years. Then, you have the nothing with the existentialists and all of that. And now, the beginning of the science of logic, becoming, of course. And becoming is not the kind of the simple autonomous becoming kind of thing. It's almost like Jockin was saying of the dwelling in like virtue. It is virtual. You have being in the becoming, which fundamentally creates a certain lack that is perhaps historically there was a need to work through the absence, but then there is also a very real sense in which when you're not encountering lack in surprise, lack is kind of absent because that's not actually lack. Lack is in the encounter in a funny way, right? So there's a way in which when you're talking about lack where we are right now, that's not like working on you, right? Like when I metaphorically make the example of wanting a turkey sandwich and not having it, Am I lacking right now? No, actually, the lack is absent because I don't actually want a turkey sandwich. I'm just talking about wanting a turkey sandwich and not having it, ergo it's lack, not nothing, right? So there's always this weird thing where when you're talking about lack, you're not in the encounter of lack. So there's a funny way in which it's actually an absence as you talk about it, and yet that absence is an absence because of the fact that humans are not autonomously rational, that we actually are A-B. The very fact that lack, as we talk about it, has a kind of absence to it, in of itself is a certain testament to the fact that humans are not reducible to rationality, because to really get lack, you have to go encounter it. How the frick do you do that, though? Because if you're like, I'm going to go encounter lack now, well, then it can't surprise you, and it's going to be like in your schematized, it's not going to hit. So there's always something outside of you that you have to then, by having a conversation here where in a sense lack is absent, that would then organize you virtually to actually put yourself in the places to be surprised where lack is not lacking, it's a present absent, right? And that kind of very tricky move, it's almost like you could say, in a kind of Hegelian sense, and then I'll pass it to Chetan and Thomas, is that history is at a point where lack as a distinct metaphysical category has arisen as historically necessary, because this is the, and Luber's not here, this is the unveiling of the theme to move out of the ironic situation. Because you start in the ironic situation, now you're glimpsing the theme that makes possible the choosing of that, which if you do not, you will be at the mercy of a rationality that gets ahead of you when it occurs, ergo the next Cuban Missile Crisis, ergo the next situation, game theory, and so on and so forth, right? So there's something you could say. I always just generally think it's best to not ever say the past was wrong. And Hegel would emphasize reconciling yourself with the process. Okay, right now we're all saying that there was a mistake, in a sense, to say that lack is nothing, right? This is where Hegel messes with you. He's like, it's a mistake, and yet that mistake was historically necessary to get you to the place where you can talk about lack is not nothing, and that makes sense and compel action. And this is why the fear of error is the fear of truth, right? And this is what you don't learn in school. You're led to believe that, truth is non-contingent upon conditionality, and that's where it's like, well, when you bring in the subject, though, and it would go to Shelby Foote. Like, let's put it this way. All right, so Shelby Foote told us that a fact is not a truth until you love it. Hegel comes along and says, the facts of reality are things you do not love until you go through the historic process to attune you to loving them. And thus they become a truth. Thus they become absolute. This is why the subject and the facts are two sides of the same coin, because you can't get truth, or what we could call absolute in Hegel, until you go through the process that makes you love the facts. That's the issue. Is like, again, facts are not truths until you love them in this sense. The subject is invested to them. There is a historic process that moves the subject collectively to love certain facts that then they become truths and compel action. So you could say the fact of being we love compelled action. Then you reach a point where now you need to love nothing. Then we reach that point, and now you can move into the loving of lack, which was always there. It was always latent, but it was a quote unquote fact of reality per se, to use that language metaphorically, that you had to have a certain historic moment to then make you love it. Now it's a truth, and now it can construct the subject according to a different quality that makes possible the moving outside of the ironic situation. And then once you do that, the funny thing is, like you were saying, the ironic situation is then always already part of the story. If you make this choice, the lack as absence is always already part of the story suddenly. It's a mistake that then becomes part of the story and thus isn't a mistake. But that contingency, which is all riding on the choice of the subject in history, determines, you can't change the facts of the past, but in a way you can change the past, is what we're saying, to allude to that great Gatsby quote from the great Leonardo DiCaprio, right? Of course you can change the past. I saw the trailer. And so that idea that actually the choice of now has this effect of changing the past in this manner. And then being wasn't a mistake. Nothing wasn't a mistake. It was all actually part of the unfolding of history to make us love the ontological facts of lack, so that they would be truths that would compel action and help us avoid, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as my go-to. But let me pass it to Chetan and Thomas. Jockin. Chetan, it is always good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well. It is a complete delight.
I'm good. I love seeing you guys. It's been really fun hearing you all in some sense, because I've been thinking about certain questions which are coming to me. Even though I agree with most of what you all saying, there's a aesthetic discord I'm feeling. I'm trying to, in some senses, voice it out because something, I've been thinking from past. Let's maybe let's try and think through this problem that Javier and I think Philip raised, and and Jockin was sort of talking about it. This question of habit was even as I was trying to think about it in that sense that there's this problem of thinking about habit on the side of repetition and event on the side of and there is this history, we know both use work in that regard, where event is thought through as an ascent from habit, in that sense, as something which is moving outside, that word we come across, moving outside of habit. Maybe let me give you provocation over here and try and think of event as something which can be descending into habit and outside of it. What kind of events can we experience by descending into habits? Let me give you an anthropological sort of example coming from Veena Das's work, not my own example. It's her work that I'm sort of putting across with other thinkers here. Veena Das, Wittgenstein, that school of thought. So she sort of talks about, she goes to the slum and a lady sort of serving her tea, and she knows from habit how much spoons of sugar everybody wants in that group. And every day these people come, they sit over there, they sit, they chat, they talk all kinds of things, they discuss politics, they discuss slums. And this lady sort of instinctively knows how much teaspoon of sugar would go in each of them. And she would know this much would be given to this, and she will take out tea at that time. Again, she'll put the sugar, she'll take out the tea. There's something about this action that cannot be grasped simply through the idea of repetition compulsion. It's not that kind of a repetition. There is something about that act of care that goes into it. I myself experience it. For instance, there's certain routines that are important for my work. And once I go out of them, and this is where my discord was coming from, because last 2 weeks I haven't been sleeping, I haven't been working, I've been trying to get back to it, I haven't been able to. And I realized that certain habits, certain routines give me a certain kind of anchoring into events. Without those certain background of repetitions in that sense, as Hegel would think about it, event cannot pop up. Event almost suffocates. What is the nature of those repetitions? How do we think through those repetitions in that sense? Where I will get up every in the morning, or I'll sleep, or I'll get my, any minute I'll wake up, I'll sit, read for 2-3 hours, write something, then start my day. And what does that process do to my day? It's not like I learned something really ingenious that makes my days really special. It's not like that. There's something about doing that thing day in and day out, which anchors me into things that are happening around me. That's, I think, the first question. I'm just leaving that question out there. Second, I think this problem of, and this is continuing from here, this question of thinking of lack again simply on the side of event. Again, the same kind of a problem emerges. That lack, at least to my understanding, lack is not simply the side of loss. This is the side of creativity in that sense. In that sense, non-relationship allows us to form different kinds of relationships. In that sense, that's the point of freedom. In that sense, that's the point of you can continue from there and start thinking about it. That virtual and actual are not these oppositions. There is no actual possible without the virtual. So in that sense, that when we dream, it's not that reality is becomes so hovering upon us that we wake up. It's precisely because in the dream we encounter the reality. And there's something about that problem which is interesting, that if it is within the virtual itself, something of the real pops out. And that's the, I think, point of subjectivity also. The subject sort of emerges in the same manner. Subject always emerges exactly at the point where we are misrecognizing, deluding ourselves, and so on. So, but then I can get into this problem of understanding versus interpretation that I think Luber was raising, and a very interesting question that that in what ways understanding doesn't allow the subject to maneuver itself in that sense. There's something about signifier in that Lacan would say that focusing on the signifier, the other signifier, this paradigmatic movement that allows subject to free itself from its own understanding. And it's a problem that subject pops up on the other side of exactly the point, and you have to just go to the extreme, to go to the how do we sort of structure this question in the larger context that you have to descend into the habit for the event to re-emerge, rather than move out of the habit for, and there is a distinction between, say, Aristotle and Wittgenstein over here. Aristotle's conception of habit was on the side of repetition in that sense. There's a history of thinking about habit in that way. Last, I'll just finish over here. Again, when you think about contingencies, I'll just simply say this. When you look back upon the history in that sense emerges from the series of contingencies. Because the history is not possible without these. You'll always find that things that couldn't have happened. And if you start asking, how did it happen? You'll be shocked. It will always be luck or something of that nature that would. But yet, there's something about the retroactive formation of the symbolic. History is a question of symbolic in that. History is a question of finding the symbolic anchoring within these contingencies. How does that become possible? I think that's the crux of this kind of problem of history that, like, say, Hannah Arendt would ask that question. Which is why you can say history is over if Fukuyama would say it. That it's not that history doesn't get, there's nobody knowing, but this anchoring into symbolic anchoring into your own past doesn't get really structured in the same way. History is a question of anchoring yourself into certain symbolic frame, which is what Hegel talks about. It history is a question of looking back from a particular context, and every particular has its own historical moment. What is it? What does that entail? In what ways that exactly the same contingency that when we look at from past to present doesn't allow us to reach the present? We'll be lost when we start from the past. We'll always be lost. That there's no way from past, because there'll be so many chances for us to reach here. And realize, how did we ever reach here? What is the probability of getting here? And probability would always be minuscule, because there were so many chances would have happened. Yet when you look back, the same contingencies anchor you into symbolic frame, into a certain structure which tells you this had to happen. There's nothing else that could have been possible. And both these things simultaneously exist. What is it about this? And I'll just, thanks.
Oh, that was so brilliant. Well, I think, and then I'll pass it to John. I think for me, as just a note, Hegel's understanding is that schema of history is what we have to talk about to understand the relation of determinism and free will, like that great debate, right? Because when you look at history, you see this radical necessity and yet contingency. And so philosophy has to reconcile itself somehow to that material. And I think what you're saying on the habit is really important as well, because there is something about habit that's tied to virtue or the formation of the subject, and yet habit only, like Hegel's like, yeah, and habit is going to be formed according to history. So you have to reconcile yourself. If you try to formulate habits according to something that is not tied to the actual, you will either get on the side of destroying the daily routine because you have this idea of what to do, or if you just take too much of a necessity, then you're just going to let your determinations habituate you without any role of freedom. The way I talk about it at the beginning of the philosophy of the right is that you have the ability to choose, in a sense, your determinations and thus turn them into necessities for your freedom because they shape your habits. To me, the question of habits that you put out, I really like James K. Smith's book. He says, and it's basically his The Desiring Kingdom, where he says, you are what you love. And so the idea is that we form habits around what we love. And like if you love it, you habituate yourself to it, right? And the critical thing that he points out is that our loves tend to be shaped by our architects, or he calls them, like you go to the mall, you make habits of, like you go to the mall, and so you see clothing you like, and that works on your love, and you develop habits in order to get that clothing, right? Because that organizes your love. And what he's trying to point out is we have to be more intentional of the determinations we put ourselves into, because those work on our loves that work on our habits. And what you're doing in a way is gaming determination. You're gaming determination to create regularity that expresses a freedom, right? Because otherwise, freedom has to move into habit. Well, that makes no sense, because habit seems like it's opposite of freedom, right? Well, look at history, though. That's what history did. And so you have to reconcile yourself to the structure of history, which has a certain determination and yet freedom in that. And you as a subject need to be in the image and likeness per se of history. And so you reconcile yourself to this. But here is the $1 million trick now. How do you habituate yourself to lack? What is the environment of lack that would work on your loves, that would then get you into habits of being toward that lack in a manner that is actually, virtuous, edifying, elevating, and so on and so forth. To me, the only way I can think about it, or I'll just put it this way, and I really like what you were saying on dreaming. Oh, this is just as a quick note. The dream is the revelation that thought always whirls. Dreaming and rationality are two sides of the same coin. We make a terrible mistake to think rationality is independent of dreaming. Dreams are what rationality would do if it didn't have to worry about sense input. Rationality always whirls. That's why it can create conspiracies. That's why it can create ideologies. It's always trying to measure itself to a completeness. But the problem is completeness is that the coherence can be at the expense of the correspondence, right? And so, but that very function of thought seeking a world, which it can find, like thought would world if it didn't have to look at this wall. If it didn't, it's running into these determinations that it has to calculate. But in the dream, it doesn't. You never dream a thing. You always dream a world. Thought always whirls. It does not accept gaps, dang it. Like it doesn't. Like you leave thought to its own device, it will find a freaking explanation. Like a dream is a revelation that thought will not settle for any sort of gaps on its own devices. Well, this is a problem though, because we're literally saying that we have to make space for lack. Thought doesn't want anything to do with that. And the dream is the revelation that it won't if it doesn't have to. So how do you habituate yourself to keeping thought from doing that without going crazy? Because this sounds like you would go crazy, right? I think about it in terms of beauty. Okay, so beauty, because beauty is something I lack, but I can create habits to put me in the presence of its possibility without guarantee, which is why I can avoid the rat utopia. Because avoiding the rat utopia, I think, is strongly tied to the presence of beauty. And this is why basically economics for me has to bring in beauty, because beauty is something that is lacking, but you can habituate yourself regularly to increase the probability of being in its presence. So for example, now I'm not saying this is a universal thing that everyone should do, but if you take walks and you make a habit of being in nature, and you make a habit of doing that kind of thing, and you just do it without even thinking about it, you eventually do it to a point where you suddenly really, really see those leaves. You really, really see things, like in a kind of Cézanne way, and bam, there it is. And that is that is possible because of the habits that was open to the event. But the only reason the event occurred is because of the habits, which is like the history, contingency, necessity. So you're forming habits, but you also are making decisions so that you can form the kind of habits that increase the probability of that encounter with beauty, right? So you, just like you reconcile yourself to history, you reconcile yourself to the fact that you must undergo determinations. You must have habits. You accept this, but you also accept that you have influence. You can influence the determinations that you undergo. Freedom is found in creating the habits of which condition you for beauty. At least that's how I would put it. And so for me, on the problem of optimization, we don't optimize for the open hand, like Michelle's bird, right? This is what, like, being a habits of lack or something like holding the cup like this, right? Open hand, habits of having your hand open, not upside down, that's nihilism, not clutched, because, that's capitalism or whatever, habits of an open hand. And then if you do that, you can love having your hand open. This is what has to happen. You have to do the work necessary for you to fall in love with having your hand open like this to receive. And then you form habits around that and you love doing it. And the connection of love and habits seem very tight. But this is why forgiveness is a big deal, because the inability to forgive threatens your love, which then threatens your ability to keep the hand open. If we don't learn the problem of forgiveness, when we encounter it's one thing to develop a habit of having your hand open, love and all of that when you're isolated around people that understand you. Can you have your hand open in global pluralism? Can you do that around other people? that's where it's difficult. And this is where forgiveness seems really big, because otherwise if you become, what do we do when we're not forgiving and we're angry? We ball our fist, you know. So if you want to keep the hand open, there's something about the problem of forgiveness that belonging again has to get into. Now, more has to be said, but to me, the question of habit is tied to the question of architecture, which then works on your architecture, works on your loves, which works on your habit, which means if you choose to put yourself in an architecture of beauty or a setting of beauty or net conversations or things where this can happen, you can then fall in love. You can have the love of that quality of experience that can come through. And then you develop habits of doing the net every week, or habits of talking with people, or habits of reading, because those then are integrated into a routine that feels like freedom. And for me, that is freedom. The very funny thing is that when routine as determination moves into necessity for freedom, there is something so freeing about knowing what you're going to do, like automatism. But here's the key: it's not the automatism of the robot; it's auto mastery, because you've mastered what kind of settings to create and the kind of work you need to do to be able to rest in a kind of Sabbath sense, to rest in the routines of which keep your hand open. So I think that, and to me, that is what Hegel's showing with the movement of history. And if we habituate ourselves as this is for the subject to reconcile themselves to the development of history according to the absolute. It is to participate isomorphically in that image and likeness. And if we don't do that, though, thought is going to race ahead and form a world where we don't have to do that, like a dream state, and then we're in a conspiracy, then the Cuban Missile Crisis has got us, and we're not able to then bind thought. The secret to binding thought from the Nash equilibrium is, in fact, the habit. That's how you do it. Thought, like you develop the spaces to habituate your thought to not rushing ahead, to not getting away from you, to actually keeping the hand open. But it's one thing to do that in isolation and something entirely different to do that with people who think you're an idiot to have your hand open. And those are the challenges. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, Javier, and then Michelle. Mr. Jockin.
I want to give one point about this virtue, habit, and freedom part. The Aristotelian accounts of this would say you actually need habits to get virtues, which give you freedom. The example is basically if you, for example, I don't speak French. I don't have that habit. I didn't develop that capacity. I literally cannot speak French, and there's certain affordances and opportunities that I cannot do as a result. So I don't think, actually, I think the issue of habit with freedom, I think it's the opposite way. Actually, I'd say you actually must have habits to actually get access to opportunities to do things, which is, it's the freedom to do things versus the freedom from, right? It's that positional difference, Isaiah Berlin distinction. I think that's quite important, because one thing that I think Jockin said that I think is very fair, and Plato talks about it, and Aristotle, is devotion, right? That kind of habituation is not just like I agree with Jockin 100%. It's not just a repetition purely. It cannot be just that. Also, because lots of things happen repetitionally that have no impact on us in any way. There has to be something else there to structure those repetitions. Otherwise, they pass through nothing. They get no effect on you. Certainly no conscious effect, let alone passively. I think devotion is one aspect, so a sense of care, right? I think that is quite fair. And I think attunement too, with that as well. It's a kind of like, because every techne or any body of knowledge, any account has some reference point of what we're looking at, what are we looking for. There's always an orientation based on that. I mean, Aristotle talks about this idea is like, I mean, every science has a mode of structure, but also a principle that it's trying to do. Health, healing, right? Medicine for health. There's both the medical science has a structure within itself of medicine with accounts and systems and understanding the anatomy of the body. All symbolic imagery, by the way, like the way people study medicines through all these symbols. Remember that, like all these diagrams, all these representations of the body, so they got to understand it now. But it's also, there's a principle, health. That's why they're doing all this in the first place. And as an Aristotelian kind of like free of rational action, it's on exactly this point. The example is the doctor. That said, the doctor has the science, the power to heal because he has that account. That's why he can choose to heal or not heal. And not even does it in an indifferent mode of either enacting or not acting, but also via contrariness, can also kill someone with the same knowledge he has to heal someone from medicine. So I think absolutely this idea of virtue and freedom is 100. This is super old school. This is very old school pre-alignment positions. But I'm sitting here going yes on all those points. And by the way, the idea of the symbolic having some connection to reality, that's the problem. It does. If we just sit here and say, oh, the images are false because they're not the reality, then we're stuck in a basic, and actually Javier's point with Meno, you get into skepticism, absolute skepticism, where you're like, then that's it. We're just sitting, if we're not in knowledge, we're just in ignorance. That's it. And then any intermediate state doesn't count. And that's the whole point of Meno, is to say, no, that's not true. Meno, Symposium, Phaedrus, all three on the doctrine of love as an intermediate state between ignorance and wisdom, right opinion, as Javier was pointing out. That's the point. It's not good enough. You can't just dismiss this intermediate state. And, it's funny, I did a in-person salon for a symposium, and the individuals in the group were having a really hard time with that. They were thinking in this bifurcated mode. You're either ignorant or you're knowing. There is no intermediate. It's fascinating. And it played through. They could not understand this relationship to love, almost as a discipline of love. It was very interesting to see that play out. I think that's it. I mean, besides that, the only other notes is Aristotle. I mean, the other point is that, like, for Aristotle, accounts of lack apply to anything that's in the contrary state of a subject. So, for example, when a stone is hot, it's lacking cold. But the point is because it could go cold. That's the point. It's like, it's not just spinning out. It's in the genus of that category. That's kind of what we're getting at here, or at least one of the modes of talking about it. You don't go from hot to sweet, for example. And I was talking to Javier about this privately. There's on the tangent note. I always appreciate Aristotle because even though he's the father of syllogistic logic, which we think is like the creme de la creme of reason as a structural entity, he's also one of the strongest proponents of analogy, the strongest. And in his solipsism refutations, for example, he actually gives you basically a little kit. It's almost like you could look at the solipsistic refutations and the logics, like the analytic, prior, and post, and also his accounts of analogy. And you see that all together, you realize he's actually giving a little equipment to address the state of ancient Greece at that time. And it's much more subtle and sophisticated than you would expect from someone who's a father of logic. Like he knew logic had a limit of what he can actually address because of its necessity to require univocal terms and understandings. That only gets you so far. Analogical reasoning is required for much more sophisticated concepts, like anageia and dumasis, for example. I always find it interesting that he never gives you the univocal definition of anageia. He does not give you that. He only gives you an analogy. That's all he gives you, proportional analogy referencing. That's all he does. There are consequences from that fact, in my opinion. Also, his problem of how to he never rectifies the primary secondary substance problem. It's his nominalism in the scholastic period. But nevertheless, I'm appreciative of Aristotle because he was very aware of, just to Daniel's point about bounded rationality, that he created this instrument of syllogisms, but he knew he cannot address all points in all ways. And by the way, here, I'll give a hot take at the close, which is, this argument of virtue, by the way, is one of my strongest arguments for theology, natural theology, quite frankly. And I stand hard that this is subject virtues, even though I agree, they're absolutely temporal. They have this conditionality because the expression of courage, the expression of temperance, the expression of wisdom, the expression of justice is going to be individuated. It has cultural normative dimensions. Of course it does. No one would deny that fact. Meno is a great example of that. He bases a whole beatdown on that whole exact point. But nevertheless, that doesn't change the fact that there is, and this is actually one of the most important things I think about virtue from Nicomachean ethics. Virtue is what preserves being. I find that fascinating as a point. Like literally, when one is in virtue, you are preserving the existence of the entities. I always find that a very interesting point. What I'm getting at here is this is not just the preservation of individual beings. There must be something that gives being in the first place, and thus. All right, Daniel, I think you already know where I'm going with this in theological accounts. But I'm just adding something extra to the table. And Michelle, yes, it was at the bottom. Thank you for asking.
Magnificent. No, I think the theological points that they're pointing to classically have been missed. You know, what they're trying to suggest, if you really pay attention to the movement of beauty and really pay attention to what virtue does, and it has this logic, just like we were saying, in a way that at the Cuban Missile Crisis, rationality gets ahead of you and has a life of its own. Beauty seems to have a life of its own. Virtue seems to have a life of its own, but it is not this self-effacing. It's almost like we've said before, like they always kind of classically understood that, you know, that evil is the kind of privation, right? It has this structure, you know, Lucifer's a fallen angel, Iblis are different things. So likewise, it's as if beauty, when it's pulling you, is similar to when rationality is pulling you. There's some kind of isomorphic relationship, but they're actually opposites in that structure. And I think they understood that and was like, well, that's weird. How is it that this thing called beauty can kind of pull you, which you clearly know is not reducible to your own subjectivity? And then, et cetera, and the wings fail the lofty fantasy. I really appreciate it. To the point as well. Exactly right. You have to start with habit. For me, this is where for Hegel, and I should also know what you were saying, like one of the reasons why Hegel like loves Aristotle is because like it's all in Aristotle with the analogy bringing it to the logic. And Hegel feels like he's expanding more like on Aristotle and bringing to the forefront. Like all he ever does is like Aristotle was the man. He has his knife, you know, I think Cadell put it, you know, he has his knife out for Kant. But, you know, Aristotle is, you know, patting on the back, because what you see is this understanding that cold logic is simply the determination necessary for moving into the warmth, if you will. Like logic is a means to move to the analogy. Without logic, the analogy could not be sensible, but you cannot reduce the analogy to logic or say that analogy has no logical underpinnings to it. There is something there that has to be thought. And there's a real sense in which it would have to be expanded on, but I'll pass it to Javier, Michelle, and then Philip, and then alas, I'll go. But I said that last week 9 times and stayed for 5 hours. But tonight I really should because of some obligations. But I said that last time as well, and that didn't stop me. But there's something about the logic of the unfolding of history that is the development of an analogy, or it's like a metaphor getting steam, that's able to bring into itself a way that's pointing beyond itself in itself by being itself in its particularity. The more that history unfolds and you reconcile to it, the more you experience it as a definitive object, as its fullness and its definitiveness, of which then points all the more to the beautiful. And so thinking of history as having an epistemological structure in Hegel as the analogy would be interesting. But I wanted to say on what you were saying. For me and Hegel, so you start like you're born, so you have habits. You eat, you sleep. But then, so you start in determination. But then you have the idea, oh, I could do something different. And then you have the idea, but that also can be your torture because you're like, wait, oh my gosh, I feel like I shouldn't have to eat a meal every day at 8 o'clock. You have the idea, you have an abstraction that then turns your determination into a torture, right? Your habit becomes a torture because you feel like, frick, I have to go to work every day. And the abstraction, so it's like David Hume talking about common life. Philosophy brings you out of the banality of evil. Likewise, you're born with just biological habits and you have the idea of something different. And then you say, no, the virtuous move is what you say, I'm going to choose my habits, which is only possible because you're thrown into habits, but I'm going to actually then choose as possible because of the act of abstraction or the virtual that made those determinations a kind of torture or feel like a prison. Now I'm going to actually work to design them per se. I'm going to reconcile with them. And what's so interesting about virtue, just like you were saying earlier, it's both here and in the future. And so when you choose your habits, in the act of now developing the habits of, say, beauty, you feel like you're doing something that's already finished. That's something that's weird to me about the kind of virtuous or the creative acts. Like you feel like you're doing something that already kind of has a certain future orientation to them. Like the habit is carrying you along to something that feels like it hasn't arrived, but has arrived at the same time. And that for Hegel would be the movement from, well, you could use the Heidegger term, you're thrown into determination, you're thrown into habits. Then you have ideas and virtual or abstractions that makes you possible to free yourself from those habits. But then the life of virtue is where you choose habits. And then now what you're doing, you say, I can't have virtue unless I develop habits that make those virtues. But then I wouldn't even choose those habits without the idea of virtue. And so there's a both kind of thing where virtue has this temporal dimension of being the future present that brings it into the designing of those habits. So I think this relationship where you start off in habits that make possible the virtue, but the problem is without the thought, You could not possibly choose your determinations. And the only reason you're able to choose determinations is because you find yourself always already in determinations that are blocking your freedom. But because you start in that limitation, it's possible to then choose determinations that then work you toward necessity, freedom, virtue, beauty, and all these different things. So because you start in the automatic, we could say, you start pretty automatic, biological, robotish, you then have the possibility of thinking, I don't want to be a robot, freedom. But then the problem is that just might be rebellion, because you're like, I'm not going to have any habits. I'm not going to have any routines. I'm just going to be free. Well, this is when freedom is a threat to virtue, because you're not seeing the role of habits. But then actually the real freedom comes when you say, no, instead of using freedom against determination, I'm going to use freedom to design determination or to choose determination or use it in service of virtue, which is a virtuous choice that then creates habits of virtue, all of which then works temporarily for the unfolding of beauty. So I think that relationship that you're talking to me is one of the reasons why it is so critical. Well, to me, it's why it does seem like knowledge is necessary for virtue. Like you were saying with Plato, because why would you ever choose your determinations? You have to have some sort of virtual capacity to choose determinations so that they work you toward virtue, right? And you have to hold that thought to stay in the habit and to not let it break up. Another way, and then I'll give to Javier, Michelle, and Philip. Why would you ever think to keep your hand like this, right? Biology would have you close it or, empty, not hold anything, or this. The idea of holding it open, where would you ever get that from biology? That's crazy talk. Well, it has to be an idea. But then the idea has to move to actually holding your hand open. And then you have to design your life into habits of loving having your hand open and keeping it open around other people. And this is where it seems like the knowledge, the virtual, the habit, and the freedom, it all comes together, because this seems to be a possibility that would not arise naturally. Certainly keeping it open, would not arise naturally. Maybe you just happen randomly, but to have a sustained situation of that would not be natural. That would require some form of intentionality. That would be only possible with the virtual, and that would keep it there. And then, of course, the point would be, we seem to be at the historic moment where this is required. This is now required. The thought of that is now required. You could put it this way. If there is something about the necessity of the absolute choice at this historic moment to avoid something like a Cuban Missile Crisis, you could say we're at the exhaustion of a history that is not intentional about virtue, that is not intentional about beauty. You are at that moment where you can no longer get away with not being, dare I say, intentional about it, which is precisely the moment of greatest danger, because you can choose no, which is the fall of Lucifer per se, because you're at that height of really seeing beauty, of really seeing its necessity and denying it, which of course, it is a far greater sin, if you will, a far greater fall to look at beauty and say, no, I don't want it, or to be in the place where you can observe it and say, no, I don't want it, than to not be in that place. So the funny thing is, this moment of great historic possibility with the realizing of lack and the quality of the subject in this special way according to beauty is simultaneously the moment of the greatest risk. Those come together, and that's why lack is so risky, and why it would then make sense that it is not until this exhaustive moment of human history that we make it, because until now there was plausible deniability, and that's not good. But let me give it to Javier, Michelle, and then Philip. Mr. Javier Rivera.
So let's talk about forgiveness, because I actually think this is a good topic. What do we encounter with forgiveness? What is the current position on forgiveness? My hunch about the current position about forgiveness is that, and this is a really interesting thing, is that it seems that most people, and I'm obviously doing a very abstract universal here, most people seem to understand that forgiveness itself lacks. It's insufficient. That's why it's not attractive at all. Because what do you gain out of forgiveness, really? But then there's the other conversation of forgiveness that kind of promises you that you would gain something. This is exactly the kind of forgiveness. If it promises that you would gain something, it risks precisely the avoidance of it. Because you see, this is the conversation that ends up happening is someone goes, well, you should forgive because this is, this would be good for you, like this, but when the person himself lacks to see the insufficiency, actually, you know what? When the person lacks, they actually see the insufficiency of forgiveness, which is precisely why they don't want to do it. But you can see when we start promoting forgiveness, and I'm not saying that you're doing this, Daniel, by the way. I'm just talking about the framework of the culture, it seems. Culture then would go, well, forgiveness is good, and you can prevent resentment and so on. But then they sort of deny the insufficiency of the subject, right? Of a subject being capable of doing so. So what I want to point out here is that once you realize that forgiveness is, this is the double move. Once you realize that forgiveness itself is insufficient, is precisely why you should do it. Is precisely why you should do it. Because actually, when you play out all the possibilities for forgiveness, is that actually forgiveness won't actually cover up what happened. It won't ever suffice. It won't bring back what happened. If a son died because of something and so on, you can't forgive the killer. You realize that even if you forgive, you can't get what was lost back. So in some sense, it's always insufficient. But I do like this idea that it's precisely because it's insufficient or contingent that it should become a necessity. This is the double move that I would say, and of course, there's complications with this. I mean, this is probably one way to do it, but I think what's interesting is that if someone say, well, forgiveness is pointless, or it just doesn't quite grasp the entire account, I would say, yes, good. Like it acknowledges the insufficiency. I think that's the problem. The other thing that I really loved here was Chetan pointing out there's a sort of habitual formation that isn't compulsive, which I agree. It's not compulsive. I think you could say that the double side of the compulsion is exactly that there's a repetition of non-compulsion that is habit. The question is, we got to this issue of devotion, which I thought was interesting because, I mean, that really does seem to be the kind of habit then, maybe. Because if it's a habit that makes it a contingency and necessity, aiming towards beauty, that would make sense. The question is, how do we move this framework, or can we move this framework from, let's say, like this idea of like spirituality? Spirituality likes to consider itself separate from religion, outside of it. It's performing habits. You could say, if I was talking to a spiritual person right now, they'd be like, I do have beauty as I do have goodness, I do have beauty as my ideals. How would we point the insufficiency of this, actually? Or is there an insufficiency in this? Because you could say my point of contention would be that spirituality denies religion for a very precise reason, right? So in some sense, it has already built a ground of practice detached from religion, detached from itself. And yet it claims the very things that we think should be the ideals, the habits towards beauty, and so on. But my main point is, I'm not trying to say that there's definitely a confusion of the good and the beautiful. But my point that I'm trying to bring out is, how do we address, how do we address this difference? Because for people, you could say it's completely absent. The difference is completely absent. And then, do we completely negate spirituality as a kind of pointlessness, or do we say that spirituality is in this weird state where right now it's starting to begin to choose its own determinations, but it needs to realize something very specific? If not, it falls into the same trap, which would be, denying religion and so on. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, they're excellent questions. I mean, and now I'll give it to Michelle and Philip. I think like on this insufficiency, there's something about spirit. Well, it would be a question of the order. You know, do you start with religion, then you have the abstraction, kind of using that philosophical term. We have the abstraction of saying, oh, I could leave the religion, and then no, I'm actually going to return to the church in that spirit. For Hegel, he put, you know, religion is kind of this higher principle that you work with, because for him, it's almost like you start, the child has wonder, and then they actually have to reconcile that wonder to a community that then is held together by forgiveness, right? But there's something here of the relationship with religion, and religion seems to need to be spiritual practices or something. They need to have a certain life. And I will say this, what's always interesting is I think about prayer a lot, and then I'll give it to Michelle and Philip. When you're younger, like a lot of people who are, dare I say, immature spiritually, we lost Philip. Oh gosh, come back. I'll pray in the spirit and it'll come. Is that when they're younger, they pray to get things. And then when they get older, they pray not to get things, but to observe God. It's more like a Thanksgiving thing. There's a kind of maturity where then prayer is a habit that's done, not necessarily trying to win a lottery, but it's almost becomes a certain observation, like an observance, or like a communion with the non-rational, so that you don't, so that you always have a connection with something beyond the rational schema. We prayed in the spirit and Philip came back. That's outstanding. So like when you follow prayer of people as they mature, it starts off asking for things. And then as they get older, it becomes much more like, no, I'm just going to observe God. And the prayer actually is all the more powerful because there's not the expectation. I think you also see that with this movement in forgiveness, where you stop expecting things, you just do it without expectation. There's something about moving beyond expectation that is maturity in these matters. You actually will see. Hegel locates that in religion. And today, maybe we actually have to locate that metaphorically in spirit, because religion has become an institution in a different way, right? But I think basically what he's getting at is the same thing, just different languages. Because for Hegel, that lack of expectation has to be in a social context for it to be deeply meaningful. Because if you do it without other people thinking you're stupid, well, that doesn't have the effect, right? Like the difficulty is not expecting anything and people see you and they think you're absurd. Like religion only emerges socially because that's the only place of the possibility of feeling absurd or being seen as absurd, and thus having opportunities of forgiveness, and thus creating a non-rationality that it could avoid a Cuban Missile Crisis, basically, to make a giant step. So I think what you're saying is really important. The last thing I'll say is and then I'll give it to Michelle and Philip. I feel like with beauty, the insufficiency is there, but it's on you. Like you're not able to see it all. You actually can experience beauty and then 10 minutes later be angry at someone. Like the insufficiency is there, whereas in, say, Lacan, it's on the celebrityism. You become a celebrity and find that's insufficient. In beauty, oh no, I'm insufficient. What will I do? Will I develop virtue or not? And so it's almost like, for me, lack as beauty makes you absent. It pushes the absence on you, per se, because you're absent from that. Like the beauty's not lacking. You're lacking from that thing that you're experiencing. So you, in a way, become the absent from beauty. So then the thing is, you don't actually get a completeness. What happens is a call. A call is put on your life. That's what I feel like happens in beauty. You don't get completeness. You get a kind of call. And that call comes from a place of insufficiency that then you decide from that experience if you develop habits to then experience that more. Like beauty's like, you know, it's like Rilke, you must change your life. And you can say, no, I don't. And the statue won't do a thing, right? But the real experience is like, wow, I got to change my life. I'm insufficient. Now you can move into virtue. Because here's the thing. I feel like without beauty, if you move into virtue, it almost has to become pride or completeness. I'm virtuous now. So I'm complete. I have virtue. I'm a good person. And then, you know, there's all this idea of sin having a pride to it, right? It seems like virtue without beauty is prone to pride, right? But beauty with virtue always means, yes, I'm getting better, but I'm still not that. So there's a humility in it, but that humility of the lack brings a drive with it. And so that, I think, is the power of beauty, is that it moves the insufficient on you, and you experience it emotionally. You experience it personally. And so that, yeah, to the privation, I like that. And like we were saying, lack is when I want a sandwich and I don't have it, versus I don't have a sandwich and don't want it. Beauty simultaneously makes you want more of it, and thus makes you experience yourself as lacking the fullness of that. So you want more of that, and you don't have more of that, and you got to work to get more of that, and you want to do it though. And basically the argument in blogging, again, is this is what's needed for economics to avoid the great stagnation, the stimulation of demand, and the auto-cannibalism of game A. So beauty has to be brought into economics. But let me bring it to Michelle and then Philip. Michelle.
Well, great to see you all. It's been a wonderful conversation. I was wondering, regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis, I kind of was wondering if we kind of were spared because of luck, right? Like you talked about that, Daniel. Then what is what would necessitate us to change or to cultivate any capacity? Because couldn't we always just chalk it up to hoping for luck? Like, oh, well, maybe we'll get lucky again. And if we think we wouldn't be, then maybe we're not open to surprise, because maybe that would be the real surprise. Like we got lucky again. So I don't know if that question makes sense, but I kind of want to know, like, what is there something like, that's why I think to think about that luck in terms of grace can also be helpful, because it's almost like from the theological perspective, right? Where, yeah, in a sense, the whole idea is that God will give you grace, but that doesn't mean that like it doesn't do well for one, or let me say, how do I put this? It's really not of good character to just take advantage of that, right? It's like, oh, well, I know God's going to forgive me, so I'll just keep doing whatever I want. Like there's this real sense of needing to recognize it as grace, so that you are kind of shattered by it, like broken by that, like in a violence way, right? Like where we talk about Flannery O'Connor and the violent grace, where it's like, whoa, I really don't like, I don't know why you keep doing this. This is kind of like completely non-rational. And then it changes one to not want to do that again, which would require grace. So for me, that's how I make sense of it. But there's still this kind of element of like, if there's always like a chance for luck, which is that chance for that openness to surprise, then why even try? Like not why try, but why cultivate this sort of change that you're talking about, so that we don't like do the Cuban Missile Crisis again, which we might not be so lucky this time. I hope that question makes sense. And I will leave it there. I was just taking dinner orders from the kids. Really quick, there's this hilarious reel where there's this dad who's like, before he had kids, he's like, I'm never taking separate meal orders. And then he's like, it shifts to when he has kids, and it's like, yes, sir, I will take, so you wanted the macaroni al dente on the Paw Patrol plate. I won't make that mistake again. And you, ma'am, you wanted the chicken nuggets with the cut carrots in spears, not circles. I won't make that mistake again either. And it's just hilarious. This reel is absolutely hilarious. But like, it's just the leftovers nights. We've got lots of options, for the kids. But I kind of feel that way, where it's like, so you wanted this, and what did you want, sir? And what? So that's what I was doing when you were like, Michelle. Okay. Anyways, thanks, y'all. You're all awesome.
Oh, that was hilarious. I think that's a freaking magnificent question. I'll pass it to Philip and Thomas. So first off, the simple answer would be, we all choose our insurance policies. And in a world with nukes, I would like a better one. There's that answer. But actually, theologically, if we're speaking in this sense, Providence seems to operate according to something like luck in revelation. And when the revelation occurs, you cannot rely on luck, because that is actually at that point a heresy. What I mean by that is, historically, because we hadn't reached, dare I say, the moment of the absolute choice, which is the moment of the ironic situation becoming aware of itself, seeing lack, thus the theme. Well, then Providence could work by luck. But now, because of the spread of knowledge, internet, the awareness of the existence of lack, and the moment of history reaching the point where it sees that, that's a revelation. And when you have a revelation or an experience of beauty or seeing something, you are now responsible for if you absolutely choose that or not. And so, if we talk theologically, because I think the secular answer would be simply, it's a bad policy. And luck in a world without nukes is different than luck in a world with nukes, AI, environmental issues. And that's the other issue is, sure, in a system that cannot possibly make any mistake so great that it wipes out the entire game, luck as a function of operation is fine enough. But things shift historically when you start talking about global consequence. Luck then becomes, you cannot rely on luck as keeping the game going. Because again, if there's no possibility of the game ending, then sure, let it be luck. But if you're in a situation now where the game could very realistically end, or the devastation be so great that it sets you back not 100 years, but 600 years, that's a different ballgame, right? And so that would be one thing from a secular answer. But from a theological answer on the question of providence, basically God's grace can step in wherever it doesn't violate his justice, okay? So like God can operate through grace if it doesn't violate his justice, and that would be wherever a revelation is not present, right? So once there's a revelation, and you freaking know about lack, you know, at least everyone in the net, sorry guys, you're culpable now, dang it, it's how it goes. You are then responsible, and I don't think providence works according to luck when revelation occurs. Then you have to make the choice, which is simultaneously why you could achieve a higher virtue, but simultaneously why you can't rely on luck. And I think this is important. In theological terms, I think virtue or sainthood or whatever language you want to use can only develop where luck falls away. Like providence, according to luck, brings you to a place where then, okay, go for it. And you're like, but I want to rely on luck. Well, then you can't be a saint, dang it. Or you can't be a knight of fate, or you can't develop. Now you've had a revelation, so now you're culpable. You have to make the choice now. But you're like, I don't want to make the choice. Okay, then this is what you are. You are Dante looking at the beatific vision who looks away. I don't want to go there. And it's very critical. Dante tells you that if at that point he looks away from beauty, he's going to be like Lucifer. Okay, Lucifer is someone who wanted luck at the revelation per se. He's seeing God. He's like, I don't want to do this. Well, buddy, that's bad. You know, that's like as big of a heresy as you got. And this is why in theology, which I think actually maps onto reality, frankly, history, theology has really real stakes. You know, oh, you want to develop? You want to be a saint? Teresa, St. John of the Cross? Oh, that's Dark Night of the Soul. I mean, when you go through any religion, like the more you elevate, the more you can't go back without incredible consequence, right? And I think there is something providential that can use luck because it's God's grace not violating his justice. But then when the revelation appears, as it must if one is to spiritually develop, then you cannot rely on luck. It calls something on you, okay? So I think providentially, that's what I would speak, and that's in a Christian framework. But I think that logic applies quite generally throughout religions. And I actually think there is a secular parallel in the fact that when history achieves a certain point that for Hegel now applies religion, if you don't, you know, move from luck to choice, well, now we're in an age where you can have a nuclear apocalypse or AI destroys us all, right? So reliance on luck is no longer guaranteed, which is precisely why there's the possibility of a quality of the subject that has never been before possible in history, precisely because of the danger of lack, precisely because this can be the moment where we destroy us all. What opens up the possibility of a subject of a higher quality in this sense is the very condition that can be the erasing of all subjects, or the great devastation of the subject. So there are very real stakes. And then the movement to what Luba was saying at the beginning, the more we glimpse this, the more the story gets going, because now we've seen the theme. But let me give it to Philip and then Mr. Jockin, and then alas, I'll have to go. Philip, please.
It's just like we're in a world full of vegetarians, you know? They're like, I don't do steaks, man. I don't do that. Like, there's so much about the disavowal, the I think you called it plausible deniability, that is over determining a lot of our lives. And I think the thing that could maybe break through is actually what Jockin said. Aristotle says it's impossible that we as human beings go from hot to sweet. And by that I mean like a move from object ego love to something greater. And it happens kind of through this transformation of the synthome being reworked, the RSI being looked at. And the idea is like, I mean, it goes with pride, like sort of like, man, we as a species, we're so hot. We are so hot, and it's like, that's, like, check me out, like, and then someone comes along, it's like, well, have you considered being sweet to other people instead of being obsessed with how hot you are? And it's like, nah, I'm just gonna make some machines to like really show everyone how hot I am. And then some people come along and they're like, hey, maybe you guys should think a little more about this. And they're like, yeah, I probably would if I wasn't so hot. It's just like it's a question of like someone comes along and they go, what would it be like to inhabit virtue, to become ensouled? And like everyone throws eggs at Plotinus, like, boo. But I think like when that happens, does like what how the hand is, I think, is very interesting. Because you have this, right? You have this, you have this, you have this, you have jazz hands. What is the sort of, how do you encounter a certain type of lack and not be locked into, well, I'm the one who always does this. I'm the one who only does this. And exactly that, the prideful opening, exactly that. And every once in a while, just being like, no, I have multiple modes. And then I think it's also interesting to ask, what are the material conditions necessary for a certain maintenance of the open hand? Because it's pretty easy to put your horse blinders on and not, take seriously that there still are a lot of people lacking that. And I wonder if part of like acknowledging the insufficiency is confronting the question Javier asked earlier, like, how necessary are my necessities? I thought that was really good. Because that kind of gets to the not yet. And real, I think, like, interesting tension with Sapolsky. And like real interesting, like, okay, I maybe don't have free choice in the way that he defines it, free will, whatever. But this ability to say, I'm going to look at the ideal versus the material and structure my desire, knowing that the ideal is what's coming through in the material, not the other way around. And so how can that kind of dance with our current situation where manufacturing demand is setting up anti-rituals when we are trying to move towards an E.O. Wilson consilience thought that acknowledges that we are entering into areas that have exponentially greater complexity? How do you meet that with virtue and beauty and grace?
Magnificent. And I should note, and then I'll pass it to Jockin, like, for me, this is why forgiveness is a huge deal, because forgiveness, hurt, is the test of the open hand. Like, you don't actually find out if your hand was open until you encounter the difficulty. And then it's like we've said, like the ironic situation, if it moves into theme and story, it's as if it was always already going to be story. Likewise, once you encounter the surprise, the encounterology, as we were saying, and you keep your hand open, it's as if your hand was always actually open. But if you close it, it turns out it wasn't actually open. It was only tentatively thus, right? Likewise, if you develop virtue before you're hurt, and then you lose the virtue when you get hurt in an unjust way, and we have to go through all that, it's as if you never had virtue. There's this retrospective thing that is always an operation. And that's why, what is forgiveness? And this is why there's, we have to get into this massive question at the end of Belonging Again, 219646926 911, is that we don't even know what forgiveness is. because we have to get into Agnes Callard, Reasons to be Angry Forever, The Sunflower, where a Nazi asked a Jew for forgiveness. Let me, as very quickly, we make a lot of mistakes when we look for an abstract ground of forgiveness versus say, okay, in the past when Jesus says forgive, in those cultures, that would mean don't take revenge and don't be bitter. But these are independent from the question of, do you open a relationship with this person or not? Well, if they're a murderer, maybe not. That's not a matter of forgiveness. That could just be wisdom and discernment, right? Because they literally are dangerous, right? But you see, in the modern mind, because we conflate the choice of relating to someone with forgiving them, right? Which then, that's not actually necessarily, and we fall into this because we're not in a revenge culture. The opposite of revenge is forgiveness. They hurt you and you don't take revenge. And then Jesus is like, forgive. That means don't have a kind of hard heart, because forgiveness is open. So let's take a murderer. There's literally a murderer. The forgiving spirit would be openness to the murderer. If they change, you don't say, well, you actually did terrible things, so I'll never relate to you. But you also have the wisdom to know they're a murderer, so I'm not going to let them in my house. We can't think these things when we don't understand the differences between revenge, bitterness, openness, and wisdom. Right now, these are all conflated together in an abstract soup, so we're all really confused about these things. But if we say, I'm always open to the Hindu, to the murderer, I'm open to everyone, but I also know that some people may have to change before I actively relate to them, but that's a choice of wisdom, not unforgiveness. But you see, if we conflate the choice of relating with the choice of forgiveness, then we get all confused. We don't know what to do. We're like, well, wait, are you saying I should let the murderer into my house? That doesn't seem right. Oh, no, maybe I'm being unforgiving and not giving them a chance to change. No, if they change, then you let them into the house. That's a spirit of openness, but you're not stupid about it. And when Jesus, I just used the Jesus example, but I think it's the same. When they're teaching to forgive, like he's like, forgive them. That means don't be bitter and don't take revenge against the people that killed me, and be open to their conversion. Okay, but that doesn't mean he also gives commands where you kick the dust off your shoes because these people have rejected you, right? If we don't have a understanding of what forgiveness is, then we are going to make mistakes or be confused when creating social organizations where we say, well, let everyone in. Well, we all know that it takes one person in a group to destroy the entire thing. But then you're like, but then I'm not being loving or different things. No, you might actually be wise, but you would be unloving if you saw that they actually started developing according to virtue, but because what they were in the past, you say, no, you can't have a chance. No, but this is where you have to be actively aware of the people around you. And the call of forgiveness is an active thinking and awareness of people, always open. You never lock the door, but you also don't actively invite people in. You have that wisdom. And then also you don't hold bitterness. These are the things we really, really have to get straight on the topic of. Now, more can be said, but the point I'm getting at, we really have to get straight on what forgiveness is without this kind of abstract, naive forgiveness. Like basically now, for most people, forgiveness is a magic spell. I just say to you, I forgive you. Like it's a magic spell. That's an abstract philosophical thing. It's not concrete. Forgiveness is the concrete reality of feeling bitterness. Well, then that's not forgiving. Or the concrete reality of taking revenge. That's not forgiving. You're not doing those two things. You are genuinely open to receiving them. But then the concrete reality is that they're very prideful and emotional. And if you let them into the group, they'll destroy the whole thing. That's not unforgiving. That's wisdom to have that sort of membrane, to use that language, right? Well, now if we're clear on this, we can start creating social dynamics that are sustainable. Right? We can start making communities because we have a sense of a justified, but also grace means of in-out. Because that's part of the problem, right? Like, how do you have an in and an out that isn't an us versus them? That's the problem. It's very clear that society to function requires an in-out membrane, right? But all throughout history, this has always been an us versus them, right? How do you have an in and out? Because if you don't have that, you don't have what? Diversity. By definition, diversity means there's an in and out. How do you have in and out without having hierarchy, without having us versus them, and that you actually see beauty in the things you're not in? Because that would be the other trick. I'm not in that group, because they have wisely decided, I trust that they're being wise, and they have discerned that I'm not into bowling like they are, and yet I see beauty in that thing I'm not in. These are the sort of things that you would have to start doing to creating a sort of pluralism of diversity. And my argument is that if we're unclear about forgiveness, we'll just be infinitely confused. And then there will be this will occur, and you'll have people then, because let me put it this way. Literally, you will not have an understanding of what the test is for the open hand if you don't know what forgiveness is. You'll get confused on if you're being unforgiving by having an us versus them. I must be clenching my hand. No, I'm supposed to leave it open, but then you destroy the organization, and then you'll never open your hand again, right? Because you don't have the right virtual sense of what would be the unfolding of the virtue, right? So then, by having a clear sense of the in-out dynamics, then you're able to identify the real surprise versus a manufactured surprise. This is critical. You can manufacture all the surprise and drama you want by not rightly understanding a situation, but this isn't a real test of lack. This is a manufactured test that isn't going to develop virtue. You need to get clarity on these philosophical principles so that you can encounter the real surprise that is part of history in the concrete versus something that's simply manufactured due to your misunderstanding. You see? Like, you can't manufacture a surprise. That's not going to be virtue. That's just stupidity. And this is another reason why I think wisdom and virtue are tied together. You have to accurately discern the limits that you can then encounter to find out if your hand is actually open or if it's only fakely opened, right? And my argument is the thing that we most unintentionally manufacture drama that doesn't lead to virtuous development is the issue of forgiveness. Do you understand? The issue of forgiveness is the number one area that we tend to, as human beings, manufacture drama unnecessarily because we don't know what forgiveness is, that then leads to manufactured drama that don't necessarily develop virtue and the beautiful because they are not bound to the concrete unfolding of the absolute, right? And so that's the thing, like, virtue has to be alignment with the actual. And if you manufacture drama from a not understanding, then you're not going to actually align with the actual. And I think, and I'm of the opinion that the topic of forgiveness is the number one area of causing this mistake. Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, from a theological standpoint, I think God can use all mistakes to do what he likes. So I'm not saying that if you manufacture drama, there's no opportunity for growth in that. There's always the improvisation. But the effectiveness and the sustainability and the ability to avoid a Cuban Missile Crisis is not so high, right? One would not want to manufacture things that cannot have the optimal, dare I say, but optimal in the virtuous sense, not the capitalistic sense, opportunity for alignment with the actual. So that's why, for me, forgiveness becomes very big, precisely because of this problem of the only seemingly open hand. But then you have to figure out what is the real test. And in order to do that, I think it has a lot that will require a proper understanding of forgiveness. Now, more can be said, but let me pass it to Mr. Jockin, and then alas, I'll have to go. Mr. Jockin.
You know, I just want to piggyback on this question of grace, Daniel. This is very important, what you and Michelle are bringing up. I forgot who it was. I don't know which one of the Old Testament. It was basically one of the female, considered a prophet. Basically, don't test God. Like, don't just sit here. It was, I forgot which one it was, where it's like the Israel was encamped, was basically, it was a siege on it, and everyone was praying for God to come save them. And the one prophet character is a female. Said, don't wait for God to do it. You got to participate with it. And this is the whole story where she goes, sleeps with the general, cuts the head off. I forgot if it's Jezebel or not. My mind's blanking at the time being. What I'm getting at here is, and there's also other examples I could go to, but that's the first one that came to my mind. God never wants us, from the theological accounts, it's never we just sit back and let God do what he wants. It's never, no way. Nope, that's not that. We would not have freedom to be judged and to have the last judgment if that was the case. No, we have to participate. The more positive way to frame it is synergy. We have to synergize. We have to get in participation with God in different ways. So one way to look at it, because that's the point. I've talked to people who are theists who say, oh, the world can go to hell. It's perfectly fine. What of it? Like, it's the divine providence of the last judgment. It's like, what of it? The world will obliterate itself. Who cares? It's fine. I think partly because they think that because they have the belief they affirm the creed, therefore they're saved. It's a kind of Javier side note. This is an example of sola fide arguments. It's like, no, you just have the faith. As long as you have the faith, you're good to go. And in fact, quite frankly, you should be. Now, Islam has a certain fun play on it where we say we actually hope we get stricken, we die with our faith. There's a play on that, but that's not the same as saying, oh no, the world should go to hell as a group. All reality should be obliterated, and we have no responsibility about it. Like, we don't have any responsibility for this. I mean, also you can make it a theological account. That's you're not taking the mantle of our stewardship to reality. Like, if you believe this account, if you believe the account that man is supposed to be the steward, the caretaker of the world, then you doing things that are actively going to lead us into a nuclear war, I don't know about that. That doesn't read to me as a very logical framework. Nevertheless, and to be fair though, that's on that side. But on the other side, it is going to, it's only, and this is actually the Meno or the right opinion, because the conclusion in there is, where does that come from? The right opinion from God. Like, that's it. And by the way, I mean, Aristotle, same point. I was about to drop the Eugenian Ethics Book 8 point about it. He's like, but when he works it through, he's like, but something superior to reason. So what's the starting point of reason? And it's not the fact that we even have the first desire to seek the good, to seek these things. His conclusion is, we have a speck of the divine, and as God is as we, and that's where it comes from. So Plato and Aristotle are both saying, no, this is coming from God. Like, the fact you get this revelation, it's coming from God. It's not coming from anything else. So I just want to point out, like, that's a tension point on this, right? I think there's ways we can work around it, and that's from a theological account. Even when you go non-theological, it gets a little more tricky, in my opinion. But I really like this question. I think about it more and more. I've brought it a couple times. I do think that it's funny in a world of complete indifference. Now, it's true. Like, in the modern Western world, it's a mode of indifference. Like, it's almost as like we have no contests, no tests to what we are. Partly because there's no there's no normative standards. There used to be a stance where, quite frankly, if you're a 35-year-old not married with kids, the social judgment will be deafening. You will be made very clear how much of an outsider you are. So that's on that point of, like, getting told inside outside. Absolutely. And by the way, it gives you a context. So that's why this is useful. It sets a measure of what your life's supposed to be. We don't have any of that now, not nearly at the same magnitude. So as a result, it's like, where's the contest? What's the tension? Where's the conflict to even reveal the reality of things? I almost feel like, something's not really real until it gets put to a test and it withstands the test, right? And I mean that in a sense of, like, basically, how do we know a building's safe? I'll use a physical object. We know the bridge is safe because it actually took to the test of time, right? It took the loads, the pressure, the weight. Even subjects, right? Your beliefs, basically. How true do you believe? How much are your beliefs really something of substance to you? You're only going to come up when you have a test to it. Your fidelity to your marriage, for example. Your claim of not, you claim that you never worked for this person, then you get the opportunity to, and there's a lot of money involved, so thus you got to answer those kind of contesting questions. I'm just chewing on this just because I find in the world where there is no external norm, the norms are being very quickly obliterated, so you can't use that as a reference point to set the measure. The only measure left is when these contests of conflict come up. That sense, I'm kind of chewing on that. And I just bring it up because on the art of love. But by the way, what I'm hearing here, I'm related to, like, not understanding forgiveness. I don't think we know what love is. I don't think we know what forgiveness is. And I don't think we know what beauty is. And that salon that I was part of, like that physical salon, where I was seeing, like, people could not process this. The understanding of love is incredibly, I think, ambiguous. I left that very depressed, but in a very particular way. Like, on two notes. One was the state of not just other people, but myself. I think it was like a double resonance on both sides. So this is not even like, look at those people not knowing. Like, I was like, do I know it? Fuck. So if we don't know what love is, and we don't know what forgiveness is, and we don't know what beauty is, really, and this is what this whole project is all about, how could we possibly make accounts to develop virtues? That's the point. It's like these contests and actions to build that virtue the habits, you need an account. And the idea of like, what's the acts of this? I think actually one of the examples, actually Phil brought it up. It was fun. It's the kind of yes and from improv comedy, where Phil basically took my example of basically predicates, right? Hot and sweet. And he just completely spun it. He just spun it in a completely rather fun way. Nowhere near my intention in any way, but it was super fun. And actually revealed a little more understanding in a very fun way. I would say under normal circumstances, this was a classic philosophy group where we had very specific understandings of terms. I would be like, no, Philip, that's not what I meant. That's incorrect. You're switching category. That's a equivocal framing of the word. That was not what I meant. And then go down this whole kind of deadening, blocking off, right? I think that's also kind of the, I think about that with Daniel. We made a comment before about nature of wealth generation. Like actually the interest of economics for you is how to generate wealth. Like any more, and that's the thing you're actually pointing out, not just in the future as if like capital is this horrible thing that destroys this pure alienating property. You're fair to say, again, I've not read that text where you talk about this, you only hinted at it, where you're like, no, actual wealth generation is true. It does happen. When there's a surplus, there's more opportunities, there's more situations, there's more encounters possible than there was before. Economic development does allow for that. I heard you, I forgot where you said that, but I caught my attention when you said that. Because these are pointing out, what are these, like one of the, maybe the best we got, and by the way, like I'm referencing not just a disciple of love, but the science of the beautiful, which is in Symposium. It's this final closing point from Diotima. I find it maddening that no one talks about it. Like I've not seen any literature about it. And it's the most, like, I was thunderstruck when I read it. Because he drops in, it's like this great line was like, no, the science of the beautiful is not images. It is not just images of beauty. That's not, these are realities of beauty. So I use the example of other people, let's use an analogy or reference point. It's like a doctor who only makes images of medicine, of health. That makes no sense. A doctor can cause health. It can, or participate and allow health to happen. That's how you want to frame that. But like that's what that line is talking about. What the heck would that possibly be? The only thing I could think of from just a qualitative point of view is this kind of these kind of, it was called redounding, kind of overflowing, redounding emanation quality. That the beautiful tends to have that quality in some way, or these acts of holding the hand like a bird, like a little soft hand action. It's always these moments of like awaiting and giving opportunities for things to appear. So I think about that. It's almost like the virtues of patience comes up. So I can kind of draw out something. I'm pointing out like I can't give you much, but if we want to actually make this a habit that people would do, and I think the most common point is I noticed that mode of awaiting. It's not willing to close the gap as soon as something incorrect has revealed itself. So again, they're using the Philip example. If I came in and immediately shut down Philip for his playful wordplay with my example, that's not an example, right? That's not going to work so good. I'm just chewing on that point. That's all I really got at this point. Oh, and let's know about forgiveness, by the way. Isn't that true? A lot of times this problem is that it is an injury to your self-image. Like, that's the point. Like, that's actually why this is incorrect. Because the injury is to your self-image. And that's the point. It's like, no, I need to do justice to you. Is it justice or is it vengeance? We confuse the two and think vengeance is justice. But that's kind of the point. It's not. Because the injury's already been done. No, it's the self-image that you need to rectify that. That's exactly the point. Because as we said, if someone kills my parents, they're gone. Not unlikely is me killing this individual, the person who murdered my parents. Is that going to bring my parents back? The answer is no. Is it going to satisfy my internal self-image injury Yeah, it will. No, that's actually absolutely true. It's fascinating. So then the question becomes, that's not a question of justice, but we will use the language of justice. This is no different than like confusing what the good is and what the beautiful is. It's exactly the same energy. I find that fascinating. I'm sitting on there and thinking about that. Because that's the whole problem. I mean, at least there's a larger project of like what philosophy should ideally teach us. One of the first things is to realize, and also and therapy too, like psychotherapy or therapy in general. Your images are not reality, bro. Like they're not. You think your images are the reality, but they're not. Which is horrifying when you first realize that point. It's horrifying, defeating. It's like all this horrendous feelings. But that's kind of the point. Like it's almost like part of the project is to get people to realize they're running on programs, they're running on images and symbols. That's all they're running on. And that's the problem, is that we get captured by it, and then we act out this way. And when we work with those symbolic realities and that kind of dynamic, then forgiveness is impossible. It's not possible. Especially when it's reality, because it's not even attached to reality. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, actually, forgiveness is actually, again, this is why, from a theological point of view, God's mercy is superior than his justice. It's actually the fulfillment of the justice in the total sense. And the reason why is that probably a lot of times is because justice, a lot in that narrow sense of vengeance, it's very narrow and it's very particularized. Not looking at the totality of eternity. Because also there's some things that will never be repaid in justice. So, example, both my parents died. Me taking the one life of that man, if it was one person who killed them, there's an inequality by that very fact. 2 lives got killed versus 1. What are you going to do? Kill him twice? You can't do it. That's the point. It's like there's all these impossibilities. But that's on that side, let alone the fact that a lot of times it's the vengeance is about the self-injury, the self-image injury that you're trying to rectify that. That's all I got.
Magnificent, and I've enjoyed this immensely. And alas, I'll run here. I've really appreciate a few things. Because we are capable of the image, because we exist, we can do images. But that means we could mistake the beautiful for the image, which then we have freedom to separate from the image. But then we could also use that freedom to confuse the image with beauty. But if you start an image, you need freedom to annihilate that image to beauty. So the image makes possible, plus freedom, the movement to beauty through annihilation of it, but it also is the very condition of the risk of replacing beauty with image, or health with images of health, and so on and so forth. So in the very structure of the possibility of beauty, as ineffable, as this ever-moving, must be a risk, must be this possibility. And the more we're aware of that, the more you're responsible, and the more it seems history is getting to that place of that awareness. In the same way that being thrown into determination plus freedom makes the possibility of then choosing that determination in a way that would give rise to virtue and the beautiful. I think the emphasis on beauty, as you're saying, is very important, because justice is for the sake of beauty. Like, just all of these things are for the sake of moving you toward the beauty. The good is for the sake of beauty. The true is for the sake of beauty. So the example in Philip, the problem is, if you interrupt, what you're doing is, and this is what school is taught with the facts, we're sacrificing the beautiful for the true, is what you're doing. It's like, well, that's not technically correct. Well, then you've stopped the movement of the freeing of speech we were saying, like the other week, right? Like, one of the things at school, or the scientism, or the trivia structure, it sacrifices the movement toward beauty for the truth, and so loses both. And so actually kind of saying, no, let the thought develop, let it go, let's see where it goes. Okay, language isn't perfect. Like, because what should have happened when all the language philosophers realized that words can never be the signified, signifier can never cross the signify, what they did, they said, well, that means language doesn't work as we proceed to use language. What that should be a revelation is that language isn't what we thought it was for. What it's for is for the development of subjects toward beauty. Language is not about accurately signifying the bookshelf. It's about creating a virtual space that develops us towards subjects toward the beautiful. So we have not learned from the deconstruction of language that language is not about the truth. It's about the possibility of people sharing through speaking a space that is a space within a space. Cairo, Derrida has that term, that then can move toward beauty. So we've not seen language as in the business of that formulation, because we've confused language on the side of true. And I think constructing the virtual, I think this also gets to where we can think of waiting in a non-passive way, because there's this one way you were pointing that's exactly right, where you say, well, let the world go to heck, because rapture and all that. Well, what's the difference between that and a kind of waiting in this active sense, right? The active waiting is the participation in the movement, waiting for the glimmer, the beauty to come forth, the quality to come forth. That's not the same as saying, let it burn all down. In fact, if the world all burns down, you won't have that space of waiting for the possibility of beauty. So you need to make sure the world doesn't burn down. So there would be the possibility of these spaces within space in which beauty can be moved toward. But what ends up happening, I think, so that's where you get this kind of waiting and reconcile. And then basically that logic that we're saying describes a community can be applied to history. You're waiting in history, you've reconciled to it, you're speaking, you're doing the work so that it can unfold and move toward beauty. You're waiting in that process for that possibility, where if you don't care about history or you don't care about the world, then there's issue, right? Then the world blows away and there's no space for awaiting. I like what you're saying there, because I think prayer is best as an awaiting. And prayer is this movement of, but you see, the problem is if you pray and you're trying to get to the truth or to get the good of the new car, then you're not using the language of prayer as the movement of a formulation to beauty. It's not having that function that language is supposed to have. The point of language is to quote unquote fail, because that failure is the path toward the beauty. It fails in terms of truth so that it succeeds in movement of beauty. The failure in the true, the words fail precisely so they move you toward the good. Because if they succeeded in the true, you'd stop moving. You'd stop speaking. Okay, we talked about it. But the very fact that I can never accurately describe a tree 100%, the very fact that the map is not the territory means that there is always the potential of the movement toward the territory. There is always the possibility of the movement toward beauty. So the denial of the access to the territory is the precondition toward the movement toward the beautiful, not a tragic. What seems to be nihilism is precisely the gift and grace, or the love letter, if you will, of beauty to move toward it. If we think that, which is a yes and, beauty is a great yes and. Oh, this is beauty, yes and, but come on, because that's not it. Yes and, beauty is one great improvisation. Oh, yes and, oh yeah, this is beautiful, but this is too, and this is too, and this is too. Let's keep going, let's keep going. One must structure their truth as a yes and. One must structure their good as a yes and, or they have not structured it according to a science of beauty. And any notion of the true or the good that is not structured as a yes and must be structured as a cutting off. And beauty doesn't cut off, it dances. It allows anyone in, but it's also wise that this dance is really advanced. You got to work a little more, but we're here when you're ready. Forgiveness is an openness for people to enter into the dance when they're ready. And basically, the science of beauty as such is necessary to avoid a rat utopia, to avoid the loss of demand, to enter into a wealth creation that's not merely an improvement of the material condition. And I think what you were saying with people, what you were saying about people leaving the symposium and really having no idea what you're saying, that goes to show you the power of socialization. Like if the notion of beauty is not even in the school system or the institution, it's really hard for it to click, right? For people to get it. Well, this is what Hegel says. He's like, absolutely. Like history has to unfold till it gets to the place where then it can click with people, because you can be looking right at them, telling them all day, but it will not click because the social condition makes that very difficult. Ergo, our situations do form our habits, which form our intelligibility and it does matter what the world is like. And this is why you can't throw away the world in the name of the space within a space, because the world creates the conditions that habituate people to the possibility of knowing the space and participating in it. And then I would also argue that habituating people to the realization of the space within the space as such, the science of beauty, is precisely the possibility of the negation sublation of game A into something like AB, or to a form of capitalism that is a wealth that is not lost sight of the science of beauty. I would also note what you were saying about tests. I think it is a massive mistake when we look at religions in the past and we don't see what they're doing as always offering tests. We think, like, let's take evangelism in Christianity. You should spread the gospel. You know what that meant in Paul's day? That meant you walk on foot a really effing long way. It doesn't mean you put up little flyers. Evangelism in the past for Christianity, I just make that example, was inseparable from remarkable tests. And as you're walking these hundreds of miles, you're wondering, do I really believe this? Because this is kind of crazy. This is really dumb. Like, to think a guy rose from the dead, what am I doing? So the test is both physical and mental at the same time. It is a massive mistake to think that you can deal with the quote-unquote meaning crisis or nihilism by simply reintroducing the metaphysics. You have to reintroduce tests. And that's what makes rat utopia turn into rat utopia. It doesn't have any tests. They have wealth. The problem is, once you get prosperity, there are no tests. So who cares? You know how we try to make up for it? What is everyone doing now? Extreme sports, bicycling, all of these that you see, all of this, and that's better than nothing. But difficulty is not necessarily the same as a test. It could be, but not necessarily. A test is what conditions you to beauty. And if you engage in, say, long distance running after your office work or whatever, and that's somehow, I'm not going to say it can't do it, but what you actually see is a subconscious hunger of people for tests. But the problem is, without tests bringing in a science of beauty, then eventually it just becomes another thing in rat utopia and people stop. They have to see how these difficult undertakings are tests. And the only way that tests can have this capacity of ensouling the individual, with merely doing dirt biking or going to the gym will not necessarily ensoul you. It could be part of the story. And if it is, it's always already part of the story. So we're not placing limits on it. But the point is, in order for a difficulty to be a test that keeps one from the rat utopia, it must be experienced as an ensouling. And an ensouling occurs in the experience of you lacking, which is when you experience beauty and it throws the lack on you. The ensoulment occurs in the moment of lack, not in the moment of full completion. You become ensouled and you become ever stimulated. You're not going to be in rat utopia because you're lacking and you feel fully alive in the lack being on you, because that lack means that there is a beauty which is wooing you. There is some sort of sacred romance that you are now part of, and your lover, that's what it feels like. Beauty has a certain loving, a certain call to it. You are being called. So why would you ever just sit still? Why would you ever turn down the test that would bring you closer to that lover? Why would you ever waste a day in which you could work yourself to be conditioned more to experience that sacred romance? Suddenly you're not optimizing for the sake of a career. You're working to be with your lover, which is a negation sublation of the optimization culture for the sake of beauty. But none of this makes sense without a science of beauty. But with it, and we think of ourselves as optimal when the lack is upon us as the very opening for the wooing of beauty that then moves us toward it, this becomes the kind of subject, the quality of the subject that I think in this day and age that people are experiencing, that becomes the possibility of avoiding Cuban Missile Crisis, avoiding rat utopias, and the possibility of an engagement and relationship and community that has not been seen precisely because it is on the precipice of an apocalypse, but an apocalypse is also a revelation of the possibility, and a revelation is a call on you to respond, to not rely on luck, to not rely on something outside of yourself, to be active. And that activity is to participate in the science of beauty as such. It's been a treat.